Hey everyone, I'm AfterMoon Horrors. Before we dive into the story, I want to know, where are you watching from and what time is it for you? It's always fascinating to see listeners tuning in from different places. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. I was halfway through clearing out the attic when I found an old leather-bound book wrapped in what looked like a pillowcase. My mother had passed away 3 months earlier, and sorting through her house felt like walking through a memory minefield. Every photo, every trinket, every scent of her perfume in the air brought back something I wasn't ready to face. But the book? It didn't belong to any memory I knew. It had a clasp on it, one of those old metal ones that clicked shut like a small secret being sealed. I almost put it aside, thinking it was just another one of her journals, but my name was on the inside cover, written in her careful, looping script. For Daniel, when he's ready to understand. My stomach tightened. I'd known my mother to be many things. Strict, perfectionist, distant but sentimental wasn't one of them. I sat down on the attic floor, dust coating my jeans, and opened to the first page. The handwriting was hers, unmistakably neat. The first entry was dated 1977. I wasn't even born yet. It began with, "It wasn't supposed to happen that way. I just wanted peace in the house." I read that line twice. The next few entries spoke about my father, about how he was ruining the balance, how the children deserve better order. My chest felt tight as I turned another page. Then another. Her tone shifted. She wasn't just venting. She was documenting, calculating. By the time I reached the entries about 19 to 81, my hands were trembling. That was the year my older brother, Matthew, drowned in the garden pond. I was 4. I remembered the funeral, the lilies, the smell of wet soil, but I'd never really understood how he fell in. According to her diary, he didn't. She wrote about how Matthew's defiance threatened the family's peace, and how she needed to restore harmony. I felt the air leave my lungs. She described holding his shoulders down, whispering that it was for the good of the family. I slammed the diary shut so hard the clasp snapped. My heartbeat was loud enough to drown out every other sound in the house. For a few minutes, I couldn't move. My head was spinning with flashes of childhood moments, her standing by the pond after the funeral, calm, her hand resting on my shoulder, saying, "Sometimes bad things happen so we can be stronger." I thought she meant it metaphorically. Now I wasn't so sure. I wanted to believe it was fiction, her losing touch with reality toward the end of her life. But when I flipped to the last few pages, the entries stopped being memories, they were plans. Detailed lists of tasks and corrections. My name appeared several times. Daniel doesn't listen. Daniel questions too much. Daniel has to learn. I don't remember walking downstairs, but suddenly I was in the kitchen, with the book still in my hand, staring at the refrigerator where she'd kept that perfect, color-coded calendar. She always said routines kept chaos away. I started noticing things, dates she'd circled, notes she'd left herself. Sunday, check on Daniel's medication. Thursday, clean pond. Even after her death, she'd been maintaining those systems, as if controlling time itself. I made myself a cup of tea, though I couldn't drink it. My hands were shaking too much. I wanted to leave, but part of me couldn't. I needed to know if there was more. That night, I went into her bedroom. I hadn't been in there since the day she died. Everything was still neat, untouched, her nightgown folded on the bed, her slippers aligned perfectly by the rug. I started checking drawers, searching for anything that might explain the diary. Beneath her sewing kit, I found an envelope labeled, "For the solicitor, in case of emergency." Inside were documents, insurance forms, my birth certificate, and something that made my skin crawl. A report about my father's death. I'd always believed it was a car accident. But the report stated, unconfirmed mechanical failure. No mention of the brake lines being cut, but the technician's note mentioned, damage inconsistent with rust or wear. The final note from the inspector read, possible tampering, no suspect identified. I sat on her bed, holding that paper like it was burning my hands. She'd been so composed at the funeral. I remembered her crying, yes, but there was something off, like she was performing grief. She'd told me, "We'll be okay now, Daniel. The house will be quiet." And it had been quiet, so quiet that I'd grown up learning not to make noise, not to question her, not to break her fragile peace. Suddenly, everything fit in a way that made me want to scream. I didn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something shift upstairs like footsteps. I froze. The house was supposed to be empty. My first thought was a mouse or a loose shutter. Still, the sound was heavy, rhythmic. I grabbed the nearest thing, an umbrella, and crept toward the stairs. Every step made the floor groan like it was warning me. When I reached the top, the air felt colder. The attic door was ajar. I hadn't left it that way. My heart pounded as I pushed it open, whispering, "Hello?" There was no answer, just the soft creak of the floorboards. The diary was on the floor where I'd left it, but now a page was turned over. The last entry had changed. I swear it had. It read, "He's found it. Time to finish what was started." I blinked, stepping back. My throat felt tight. I ran downstairs, checked the locks, everything was still bolted. I must have stared at that front door for 5 minutes before convincing myself it was exhaustion. I was reading things wrong, hallucinating from stress. But then I noticed something on the kitchen counter. My tea mug from earlier, it was empty. I hadn't drunk it. My chest constricted. I could feel my pulse behind my eyes. I opened the back door, stepped outside, and threw up into the grass. I slept in my car that night, parked 2 streets away. The next morning, sunlight didn't make the fear fade. It just made it absurd. I told myself I'd imagined it, that grief was messing with my head. Still, I couldn't let it go. I went back in, grabbed the diary, and took it to the police. I showed them the entries. The officer, middle-aged, polite, read a few pages, frowned, and said, "We'll keep this for examination, but these could be delusions. Without physical evidence, there's little we can act on." He was right. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no proof she'd killed anyone. My mother was gone, and dead people couldn't be charged. That should have been the end of it. But later that week, I started noticing strange things. My neighbor, Mrs. Cartwright, an elderly woman who'd known Mum for decades, stopped me one morning. "Your mother was proud of you, Daniel," she said. "She told me you were the only one who listened." I forced a smile, but then she added, "She said you'd make the family whole again." I asked what she meant, but she just chuckled and shuffled away, muttering something about keeping the peace. That night, I couldn't shake it. The phrase "keeping the peace" was all over the diary. I decided to clean out the house entirely. Sell it. Move on. But when I reached the basement, I found something that made me sit down on the cold concrete floor. Behind the water heater was a small wooden door I'd never noticed before. It looked like part of the wall, painted over. My hands shook as I pulled it open. Inside was a narrow crawl space, and the smell that came out made my stomach lurch. There was a box, a metal one, sealed with tape. I dragged it out, pried it open, and found children's drawings, some old toys, and photos. My brother's face smiled up at me from one of them. But behind the photos, tucked inside an envelope, was a folded note in my mother's handwriting. "One more correction to make. Daniel will understand." I dropped it and backed away until I hit the wall. My vision tunneled. I wanted to burn everything to erase the entire house, but I couldn't move. When I finally stood, I slammed the crawlspace shut and left it like that. I didn't tell the police. I didn't tell anyone. Some part of me was terrified of what else they might find, or what it might mean for me. Because the more I read, the more it seemed like she'd been preparing me, like I was supposed to continue her twisted version of order. I stayed in a hotel that night, trying to convince myself to leave town. But around midnight, I got a call from the station. The officer who took the diary said they'd found something under the last page, an imprint from another note. He read it to me. "He'll thank me one day for keeping him safe. He'll make the family right again." My voice broke when I said, "What does that mean?" He hesitated, then told me they'd sent the handwriting for analysis. The imprint wasn't old. It was recent days before her death. My mother had been writing right until the end, planning something. I went back one final time. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. Every object was placed perfectly, like she'd arranged it all for me. On the kitchen counter was the one thing I hadn't noticed before, a small photo of her holding me as a baby, taped to a new piece of paper. Across the top, written in her sharp, deliberate script, "He finally understands." My knees gave out. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at that photo, realizing the truth I'd been avoiding. Every plan, every act of control, every death she believed it was love, twisted, broken love. And somehow, she'd managed to make me finish her story by uncovering it. That was her final correction. I sold the house a month later. I never went back to Norwich again. But sometimes, when I wake up at night, I swear I can still hear the sound of her voice behind me, saying softly, "You see, Daniel, the family is perfect now." And I wonder if, in some awful way, she was right, because no matter how far I go, I'll never escape the order she built inside my head. Before we jump into the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We really need your love and support. It means the world to us, and you're the reason this channel keeps going. He woke me up before sunrise again. No explanation, just the sound of his boots on the floorboards and the hiss of the propane lamp. "Up," he said, his voice flat, eyes already on the rifle leaning against the wall. My muscles ached from the night before, but I didn't dare hesitate. When Dad said, "Up," you moved. That winter of '94, I was 12, and he said we were training to survive the world when it collapses. I used to believe him. I really did. He made me layer my clothes in silence. Thermal shirt, sweater, coat, gloves. I remember my breath fogging in the cold kitchen as he spread a map on the table. "You'll walk to the ridge today," he said. "If you can't make it, you don't deserve to eat." I looked at the red line he'd drawn on the map, about 5 miles through the frozen forest north of our property. It was -20 outside, and the snow was waist-deep in some places. I told him maybe it was too dangerous alone. He smiled in that quiet way he did, the kind that made my stomach turn. "Danger is the point, son. Fear keeps you alive." Then he handed me a dull compass and a single protein bar. I didn't ask questions anymore. Asking questions meant lectures, sometimes worse. I stepped outside, the cold biting instantly at my face. The world was still just trees, snow, and silence. I trudged forward, hearing only my breath and the crunch beneath my boots. Halfway through, my legs began to burn. I stopped to catch my breath, thinking I'd rest for a moment. That's when I heard it faint, but real, a metallic clang somewhere behind me. I turned, expecting to see nothing. But I saw tracks. Fresh ones, his boots. I panicked a little, called out, "Dad?" No answer. The wind carried my voice away. I started walking faster. The ridge wasn't far, maybe another mile, but the sound came again closer. I knew he followed sometimes, to make sure I didn't cheat. But something about it felt off this time. The steps didn't match his usual pace. They were erratic, unsteady. When I finally reached the ridge, I turned and looked back down the slope. A dark figure was standing by the tree line, watching. I waved, thinking it was him, but the figure didn't move. I shouted again, but it just stood there too still, too long. Then it stepped forward and disappeared behind a tree. I waited, shaking, staring at the spot for what felt like forever. When nothing happened, I started my return. My chest hurt from the cold and fear. Halfway back, I stumbled on something, a patch of disturbed snow. I brushed it aside and found metal the corner of a tin box. Inside were photographs, old ones. All of a boy about my age, wearing the same jacket I was wearing now. In one photo, he stood in front of the same cabin we lived in. Another showed him kneeling beside my father, both smiling stiffly at the camera. On the back of one picture, in my father's handwriting, was written, "Day 14, Progress." My hands went numb. I looked around again, the trees closing in, everything suddenly too quiet. I stuffed the box in my coat and ran the rest of the way home. When I burst through the cabin door, he was there, sitting by the fire, sharpening his knife. He looked up like nothing was wrong. "Back already?" he asked. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Who's the boy in the photos?" He froze for a second, just a second, before smiling. "That was my first son," he said softly. "He didn't make it." My stomach dropped. "Your first son?" I stammered. "You mean, before me?" He nodded. "Some lessons are learned the hard way." He gave up too easily. His voice was calm, almost sad. "But you're stronger." I wanted to scream, to ask why I'd never heard about him, but I was afraid of his eyes, that distant, almost proud look. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak in the cabin made me jump. I kept thinking about the boy, my brother, buried somewhere out there in the snow. Around midnight, I heard him moving outside, the crunch of boots circling the cabin. I peeked through the curtain. He was carrying a shovel. I stayed completely still, pretending to sleep when he came back inside. He stood over me for a long time, his breathing calm, controlled. Then he whispered, "You did good today." In the morning, he told me we'd be doing another drill, an overnight one this time. "You'll sleep outside tonight," he said, like it was nothing. I told him I couldn't, that it was too cold. He didn't argue. He just said, "Weakness gets buried." I knew what that meant. I'd seen him bury things before: dead rabbits, broken traps, anything he called useless. I wondered if he'd buried that boy himself. When he went out to chop wood, I grabbed the tin box again and looked closer. There was one more photo, hidden under the rest. It showed the boy standing beside a freshly dug hole. Behind him, my father held the shovel. The date on the back said February 1991, 3 years before I was born. I couldn't breathe. My birth certificate said July 1994, but Mom had died giving birth, or so he said. What if she hadn't? What if I wasn't even who I thought I was? By evening, I decided I had to get out. I stuffed the photos in my pocket, layered my clothes, and waited for him to fall asleep. The lamp went out around 10. I waited another hour before opening the back door. The air hit me like a knife. I ran as quietly as I could, heading toward the forest road that led to town. But after a few minutes, I heard him shouting. My name echoed through the trees, deep and furious. "You think you can survive without me?" he yelled. "You're nothing without me." I ran faster. The snow dragged at my boots. Then crack a gunshot tore through the quiet. I dropped flat. The bullet hit a tree a few feet away. He was hunting me. "Come back, and I'll forgive you," he screamed. "You know what happens to boys who fail." His voice was close now. I forced myself up and stumbled downhill, lungs burning, vision blurring. The second shot whizzed past my shoulder. I didn't look back again. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights through the trees, a pickup truck stuck halfway down a snowy trail. I waved like crazy, crying, begging for help. The man inside rolled down his window. "You okay, kid?" he said. I didn't even have words. I just said, "Please." "He's coming." The man opened the door and pulled me in. I turned once more toward the forest, nothing but darkness. He drove me to the nearest police station in town. They sent officers out immediately. They found the cabin, found the shovel by a half-dug pit, found the tin box where I said it was. But they didn't find him. He was gone. The tracks led into the woods and stopped by the frozen river. For years, I told myself he drowned. That's what the police assumed. I wanted to believe that. They placed me in foster care in Calgary, gave me therapy, tried to help me rebuild. I didn't talk much about it. Sometimes I'd dream about that ridge, about the figure watching me from the tree line. Sometimes it was him, sometimes it was the boy in the photos. I grew up trying to forget, but there's one thing I never told anyone. 6 years later, when I turned 18, I went back. Not to the cabin it had burned down by then, but to the forest. I wanted closure, I guess. The snow had melted early that year, and the land looked smaller, less terrifying. I walked up to the ridge where I'd found the box. The tin was still there, rusted and half buried. I opened it and froze. The photos were gone. In their place was a single note, folded and clean. Day 1, new son found, stronger this time. There was a small Polaroid attached. It was a boy, maybe 10 or 11, standing by a cabin I didn't recognize. But the man beside him, even older now, bearded, eyes wild, was unmistakably my father. And behind them, through the window, I could see another face watching. A girl's face. She looked terrified. I dropped the note and ran. I don't even remember how I got back to my car. I drove until the road signs turned blurry. I didn't tell the police that time. They'd never found him before, and I wasn't sure they ever would. But sometimes I think about that new son, wherever he is now. Maybe he's still out there in the woods, learning how to survive. Maybe he's stronger, like Dad wanted, or maybe he's buried under the snow, waiting for someone else to find the box. I can't look at maps anymore. I can't stand the smell of propane or the sound of boots on floorboards. Every winter, when the snow starts falling, I feel that same cold from 19 to 94 creeping up my spine, that same helpless, frozen fear. Because even now, after all these years, sometimes I dream of a knock at my door, and in the dream, he's standing there, smiling, holding a compass. He says, "You finally made it, son. Ready for another lesson?"
Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments.
I didn't plan to step inside that house again. After my mother's funeral, I told myself I'd sell it through an agent and never look back. But when the lawyer said I had to sign some documents in person before the estate could be transferred, I drove to Ghent against every instinct I had. The old townhouse was smaller than I remembered, squeezed between two newer buildings, its windows clouded from years of dust. I stood at the door for a long time before pushing it open. The air inside was stale, still carrying traces of her perfume, something sharp and floral that used to give me headaches. I walked through the hallway, shoes creaking on the warped floorboards, and felt that weird pull of childhood memories, the kind that feel half-invented. The smell of turpentine was faint but familiar. She'd been painting until the end, apparently. My mother wasn't exactly an affectionate woman, but she was obsessive about her art. When I was little, I wasn't allowed to touch anything in her studio or even look at her while she worked. I remember she once told me, "Some things aren't meant to be seen unfinished." At the time, I thought she was talking about the paintings. Now, I'm not so sure. The lawyer had mentioned there were still some of her works left in the attic, probably valuable. I wanted to get it over with. I climbed the narrow stairs, ducking under a low beam, my flashlight flickering against the slanted ceiling. The attic door was half closed, as though someone had been there recently. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me: paint, mildew, and something metallic underneath. There were canvases everywhere, leaning against the walls, stacked in uneven piles. Most were covered with sheets, some wrapped in plastic. I pulled one open, expecting another of her abstract nightmares, those smeared colors she used to call expressions of mortality. But this one was different. It was a portrait of my father. He was sitting in his favorite chair, wearing the same wool sweater he always wore, the same tilt of his head, but his eyes were wide open, and his mouth was frozen mid-gasp. The detail was eerie. Even the veins in his hands looked real. What made me step back was the background. She'd painted the exact wallpaper from our living room, including the water stain above the lamp. And then I noticed something else. There was a thin cord around his neck. My father had died of a heart attack in that chair 15 years ago. That's what we were told. I remember her calling me, calm and detached, saying he was gone. I stared at that painting for a long time, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. She had been there when it happened. Maybe she painted it later as a memory. Artists process grief differently, right? That's what I told myself as I reached for the next canvas. This one was my Aunt Elise. I recognized her immediately, the same pink cardigan, the same pearl necklace. My aunt had fallen down the stairs one winter, slipped, and broken her neck. But in the painting, her body wasn't at the bottom of the stairs. It was positioned halfway down, twisted unnaturally, and her face, it wasn't fear I saw there. It was confusion, like she'd been pushed. By the third painting, my hands were shaking. It was my brother. The brushwork was rougher, rushed maybe, but unmistakable. He was lying in the bathtub, water lapping around him, eyes open. The same chipped tiles, the same blue shower curtain. He had drowned when he was 10. I was 12. I was the one who found him. But in the painting, I saw something that didn't fit the reflection of a woman's face in the bathroom mirror. My mother's. I backed away, knocking over a small easel. My chest felt tight. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I looked around the room, terrified to see another one, but there were more. Dozens. Some faces, I recognized: neighbors, distant relatives, even our old housekeeper. All dead. All painted in their final moments. There was one canvas covered with a white sheet in the corner, standing on its own. I didn't want to see it, but my hands moved on their own. The sheet was heavier than it looked. I pulled it off and froze. It wasn't finished. But it was me. The face was there, half-painted, pale and hollow. My hair was right, even my small scar near the eyebrow. But the eyes were blank, no color yet. My body was still just sketched outlines. My throat had a faint gray line across it, like a suggestion of what would come next. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The paint was still wet. Someone had been here recently. I spun around, heart pounding, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The attic was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere below. I called out, "Who's there?" Nothing. My voice echoed softly against the beams. I told myself maybe the lawyer had checked the place. Maybe he came up here before me. But then I noticed the stool near the easel still warm to the touch. I stumbled down the stairs, tripping on the last step, and ran to the kitchen, the same one I'd grown up in. The kettle was on the stove. It looked new, shiny. Someone had boiled water recently. The sink had a half-empty cup beside it. That's when I realized there was a second cup too. I couldn't think straight. I went outside, gulping cold air. I called the lawyer immediately, asking if anyone had access to the property. He said no, it had been locked since her passing. "Why?" he asked. I didn't answer. I booked a hotel that night, unable to sleep. My mind kept going back to that painting, my unfinished face, her careful strokes. I thought of her phrase again, "Some things aren't meant to be seen unfinished." Maybe she had meant this her own death's unfinished cycle. But part of me needed proof. The next morning, I returned with my phone, determined to photograph the paintings before leaving for good. The attic looked the same at first glance, but when I reached the corner, the unfinished painting was gone. The stool, too. In its place was a blank canvas, untouched. I froze. My flashlight flickered again, and I felt that instinctive crawl at the back of my neck, the sense of being watched. I turned slowly. On the far side of the attic, one of the sheets had slipped off another stack of paintings. I hadn't seen that one before. It was recent. Too recent. My mother, lying in her bed, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, exactly how she looked at the funeral. The date signed at the bottom was 3 days before she died. My stomach twisted. I took a few photos quickly, but my phone froze, screen flickering. When it came back, the images were black, just static and blur. I backed away toward the stairs, keeping my eyes on that blank canvas. Halfway down, I heard the softest creak above me, someone shifting their weight on old wood. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the keys twice before getting in. I drove straight to the police station. I told them everything, the paintings, the signatures, the timing. They took me seriously at first, sent an officer to check, but when they returned, they said there were no paintings at all. The attic was empty except for some old boxes. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, some stress-induced breakdown. Grief can play tricks, right? But then the officer handed me something. They'd found one small piece of canvas, torn from a frame. It had the lower corner of a signature, my mother's, and a fragment of color that looked exactly like my sweater. That night, I couldn't stay in the hotel. I drove back to the house one last time. I needed to know. Maybe I thought I could destroy what was left, burn it, anything. The door was unlocked. The lights were on. I don't know why. I went inside. I just followed that same smell of paint. It was stronger now. In the living room, the easel stood in the center of the floor. A single canvas rested on it, covered with a sheet. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I stood there for a long time before reaching out. My fingers barely brushed the edge of the fabric. Then I heard a voice, low and trembling, coming from somewhere close behind me. "You shouldn't have looked at them." I turned. No one was there. I ripped off the sheet. It was me again, but this time, finished. The face was fully detailed now, the eyes painted with lifelike precision, glistening as if wet. My head was tilted back, mouth open, and around my neck was that same faint gray line, now filled in crimson. The background was my mother's living room. My current position. My knees gave out. I crawled backward until I hit the wall. The room felt smaller, closing in. The smell of turpentine burned my throat. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My chest was tight, heart hammering out of rhythm. I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the glass frame beside the sofa, someone's silhouette standing right behind me. When I spun around, the room was empty again. The only sound was the faint dripping of something on the floor. I looked down. A single streak of red paint had fallen from the canvas to my shoe. It looked too dark to be paint. I stumbled toward the door, gasping, the world tilting. My hand hit the wall for balance, and I felt something wet on the wallpaper. I pulled back. My fingers were streaked with red. Paint or blood, I couldn't tell anymore. I don't remember how I made it out. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car, engine running, headlights aimed at the house. I watched the curtains in the living room shift slightly, like someone was standing there, looking out. But the silhouette wasn't my mother's, it was mine. I left Ghent that night and never went back. The house sold a few months later, and the new owners renovated everything, stripped the walls, replaced the floors. Last I heard, they turned the attic into a guest room. Sometimes, when I dream, I see her paintings again lined up perfectly, every detail crisp. But the one that wakes me up sweating isn't the one with my face, it's the new one she never got to finish. The one I found blank, because in the dream, it isn't blank anymore. It's someone else I recognize, someone still alive, and every time, it's painted more completely than before. He was already shouting before the whistle blew. "Stand straight, lad, eyes forward." His voice cut through the morning air, sharp and cold like the wind that whipped through our small back garden. I remember my feet slipping on the wet concrete, my arms trembling as I held a broomstick above my head like a rifle. I wanted to drop it, to tell him I couldn't do this anymore, but his stare froze me. My dad wasn't a man you talked back to. He was a man you survived. I was 12, but in his eyes, I was a soldier. Every morning before school, before the sun came up, he'd wake me with his whistle. Sometimes I could hear it in my dreams first, that piercing sound that meant another round of drills, push-ups, marching, salutes. I didn't even know what half of it was for, just that if I did it wrong, he'd say I was letting down the regiment. He never said which one, just the regiment, like it was a ghost he carried around with him since the war. My mum left when I was 8. He said she was weak. I think she just got tired of the shouting, of seeing me stand barefoot in the garden while he barked orders like I was his private. After she left, he got worse. He started keeping score. He had a notebook, brown and frayed, where he marked every failure. One missed salute. One tear. One sign of cowardice. It didn't matter if it rained, snowed, or if I was sick. Soldiers didn't rest, he said. I wasn't his son anymore. I was his project. The only thing that kept me sane was Callum. He lived 2 doors down, always hanging about with his football under his arm. Sometimes, when Dad was at the pub, I'd sneak out to play for a bit. Callum used to joke that my dad should have joined the army again, just to stop torturing me. I'd laugh, but not too loud. There was always that voice in my head, Dad's voice, telling me laughter was for the idle. I'd started to believe it. The day it happened, the rain was coming down hard enough to sting my skin. It wasn't supposed to be that bad, but he said rain builds character. Move like a soldier, not like a soaked sponge, he shouted. I was in my school uniform, he'd said, it would teach me discipline. The fabric clung to me, heavy and freezing. My boots made sucking sounds with every step. I wanted to stop. I wanted to go inside and sit by the radiator like a normal kid. But I kept marching. When my knees gave out, I thought he'd help me. Instead, I heard him sigh, like I'd disappointed him again. I tried to stand, but the world tilted sideways. The broomstick slipped from my hands. The last thing I saw before hitting the ground was his expression, no fear, no panic, just calculation. Like he was deciding how to explain this later. When I woke up, the house was quiet. My head throbbed and my arms were cold. I was on the sofa, a blanket over me. The television flickered on the opposite wall, muted. My dad sat in his armchair, cleaning his boots like it was just another evening. You fainted, he said without looking up. A soldier learns from weakness. I tried to speak, to tell him I couldn't do this anymore, but my throat burned. He glanced at me then just once. Don't embarrass me again. At school the next day, I could barely walk straight. Callum noticed the bruises on my wrists from when I'd fallen. You all right, mate? He asked. I told him I tripped, but he didn't believe me. After class, he followed me home and saw Dad waiting at the gate in his old army jacket. Another day of training, Dad said proudly. Callum didn't say anything. just looked at me like he wanted to drag me away right then and there. That night, I heard whispering through the thin wall between our houses. Callum must have told his mum something, because she came knocking on our door the next morning. My dad answered, polite as ever. "He's a strict father, that's all," he told her, smiling that military smile that hid everything rotten underneath. She left looking unsure, and I got the punishment later, 50 push-ups for betraying command. By the end of that week, I started coughing blood. He said it was normal after endurance. I couldn't go to school, couldn't even get out of bed without my muscles screaming. He didn't call a doctor. He just sat by my bed, reading from some old military manual, muttering lessons about loyalty, endurance, obedience. Every word was like a nail hammered into me. I started to think maybe he was right, that maybe I really was weak. That's how he broke me. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of the whistle. But it wasn't morning. The house was dark, and he was standing at the foot of my bed, eyes wild, breathing hard. "Up," he whispered. "We're going to finish this." His hand clamped around my arm, dragging me up. My head spun as he shoved me toward the door. "You think soldiers get to sleep through the night?" he shouted, pushing me into the garden. The rain was back, heavier than before, and the cold cut through me like knives. "March!" I tried to. I really did. My legs moved like rubber. He kept yelling words I couldn't even understand anymore. My vision blurred, my breath came out in shallow bursts. I remember saying, "Dad, please." He hit me then, not hard enough to knock me out, just enough to make the world spin again. "Don't call me that," he said. "You're not ready to be my son." The next part comes in flashes. I fell, the concrete hit my head. There was blood, warm and slick. I remember hearing him breathing, heavy, angry, before everything went silent. I must have blacked out, because when I opened my eyes, it was daylight. I was lying in the same spot, covered with a blanket. He'd gone inside, probably figuring I'd wake up eventually. My head felt like it was splitting open. I crawled toward the fence, and that's when I saw Callum. He was standing there, pale, eyes wide. "Jesus. Tommy," he whispered. "He's gone mad." He climbed over the fence, helped me up. I told him not to. Dad would kill him if he found out, but he just said, "He already tried to kill you." We made it to his house, his mum nearly screaming when she saw the blood. She called the police before I could stop her. They came within an hour. By then, Dad was gone. He'd packed his army bag, left a note on the kitchen table. "A soldier accepts consequences." They found him a day later, near the docks, sitting on a bench, staring at the water. He didn't run, didn't argue, just saluted when they cuffed him. I spent a few weeks in hospital. The doctors said it was exhaustion, mild concussion, and malnutrition. They asked a lot of questions. I didn't answer most of them. What was I supposed to say? That my dad thought he was turning me into a weapon? That he saw me as his unfinished mission from a war that ended before I was even born? When they released me, I went to live with Callum's family for a bit. His mum was kind. She made sure I ate, that I slept in a warm bed. But nights were the worst. I'd wake up thinking I heard the whistle, that sharp blast cutting through my dreams. Sometimes, I'd sit by the window, watching the rain hit the pavement, wondering if he was somewhere out there, still marching. Months later, they told me he'd been committed to a psychiatric ward. Post-traumatic stress, the doctors called it. Said he'd never hurt anyone again. But they didn't know him like I did. They didn't know how deep the training went, how real the delusions had become. He didn't believe he'd done anything wrong. He thought he was saving me from the same weakness that destroyed his unit, whatever that meant. I got older, tried to forget. But every year on the same date, the day I collapsed, an envelope would arrive. No return address. Inside was always a single sheet of paper, typed neatly, like an official report. Each one had a new lesson. Discipline is survival. Weakness is death. You are still enlisted. The last one came when I turned 18. Mission complete. You made it, soldier. That was it. No name, no address, just that one line. I never got another. You'd think I'd feel relief, but I didn't. I kept expecting him to show up again to see that shadow at the gate, that glint of metal buttons on his old jacket. Even after he died, which I found out years later, I still dreamed about the whistle. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing his voice calling my name not softly, not like a father, but like a command. Callum and I don't talk much anymore. He says I should be proud of how far I've come. He says my dad's ghost doesn't get to own me. But sometimes, when it rains and the wind blows against the windows just right, I hear it again, that high, sharp note echoing in the dark, and I can't tell if it's real or in my head. And every time, before I even think, before I even breathe, my body reacts on its own. My back straightens, my hands lock to my sides, my eyes look forward, because no matter how many years pass, part of me will always be standing in that cold garden, waiting for his next command. When the construction crew started tearing down the walls of my childhood home, I told myself I wouldn't go inside. I thought I'd just watch from the outside, sign the papers, and let the memories stay buried where they belonged. But when they pulled off the plaster from the back room and I saw that pale, familiar patch of wallpaper, faded blue with little stars drawn on it, I couldn't help myself. I walked in. It was smaller than I remembered. That room used to feel endless to me. A place where time didn't move. My father called it the quiet room. It was supposed to help me calm down, though I don't think I ever actually did. The floor was still uneven near the corner, the same one I used to count tiles on while waiting to be let out. I could almost hear my mother's voice from the kitchen, calling it necessary discipline. I was 6 when they first started locking me in there. Sometimes for shouting, sometimes for spilling milk, once just because I cried too loud. The walls were padded with some kind of cheap foam, and the door didn't have a handle on the inside. I used to think that's what all houses had, rooms for kids to be quiet in. But as I grew older and stayed at friends' houses, I realized none of them did. I remember asking my mom about it once, maybe when I was 10, and she said, "You were our only child, darling. We needed peace sometimes." The way she said it made me stop asking questions. Decades later, after they'd both passed, the house fell into disrepair. When the city bought the property and called me about demolition, I felt nothing at first. Just relief. But standing in that room again, with dust floating in the air and the faint hum of machinery outside, something strange hit me. There used to be a vent near the baseboard, right next to where I sat. I remember whispering through it sometimes, like talking to an imaginary friend, but now it was gone, completely sealed. I asked the foreman if they'd covered it up already, and he said no, it had been filled long before they even arrived. That's when I started feeling dizzy. I crouched near the wall, tracing the plaster, and noticed a hollow sound when I tapped one section. "We'll be opening that up anyway," the foreman said, shrugging. "Probably just an old pipe." But my stomach twisted. I waited while they pried it open, piece by piece. The first thing that fell out was fabric, stiff, gray, and brittle. Then came something that made one of the men swear and step back. It was a small bone. Not animal, human. They called the police immediately. I remember standing outside, leaning against the fence, trying to breathe. The cold Danish air didn't help. It felt like my lungs wouldn't expand properly. An officer came over and asked if I knew anything about who might have been buried there. I laughed a stupid, broken laugh and said, "I grew up here. I'd remember if someone died in that room." But even as I said it, something in my memory stirred. A flash, a sound, a voice crying faintly through that vent. My imaginary friend. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed at a small hotel near the city center, staring at the ceiling until sunrise. My dreams, if I even slept, were full of that faint whispering. When the police called the next morning, they asked if I could come to the station for a few questions. I sat in a small room, clutching a coffee cup I never drank from, as they told me what they'd found. The remains belonged to a child, the detective said. Male, between 6 and 8 years old, roughly 40 years deceased. I didn't say anything at first. Then he added quietly, "We also found a fragment of fabric with embroidery. It had a name stitched into it, Jonas. Does that mean anything to you?" I nearly dropped the cup. The name hit something deep, something old and buried. I used to whisper that name through the vent. I didn't know why. I always thought I made it up. The detective told me there were no records of another child in the house. No hospital files, no birth certificate. My parents had only ever registered one son, me. But when they showed me a faded photograph found in an old album they'd pulled from the house, everything cracked open inside me. It was a family picture I'd never seen before. My parents, younger, smiling stiffly, and between them another boy. Same dark hair as mine, same eyes, a little older. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, Jonas and Emil, 19 to 75. I must have stared at it for minutes before speaking. I thought I was their only child, I whispered. The detective looked at me with pity I didn't want. Did your parents ever mention another son? He asked. No, I said, never. But that wasn't true, was it? I remembered something then. A night when I was maybe 5. I'd woken up to shouting. My mother's voice, shrill and desperate. My father yelling, he needs to learn, then silence. And the next morning, breakfast like nothing happened. After that, things shifted in my memories. There were gaps that suddenly didn't feel like gaps anymore. My earliest recollection of the quiet room wasn't being punished, it was being told to wait here and be good. I wasn't crying then. I was listening. To muffled noises from the other side. I used to think it was the wind. But what if it wasn't? Over the next few days, the police kept digging. They found a small toy car, rusted and half-melted from years underground. I didn't recognize it, but when they showed me, something in me wanted to scream. I knew that car. I had one just like it when I was a kid. My father used to say he'd bought it for me after I'd earned it. But now I wasn't so sure it was ever meant for me at all. I visited the house once more, before they sealed it off. The floors were stripped, and the walls gaped open like broken ribs. I walked into the quiet room and sat where I used to. The air was different, still heavy, but not silent anymore. I spoke aloud, softly. Jonas, were you here? For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint echo. But maybe it was just the sound of my own breath trembling. After the forensic tests confirmed DNA relation, there was no more denying it. The bones belonged to my brother, my real brother. The police told me death was likely from blunt force trauma, maybe a fall, maybe something worse. They couldn't tell. There was evidence the remains had been there for decades. Before the room was remodeled, my parents had sealed him behind the wall and built that soundproofing around it. It's hard to explain what happens to your mind when everything you believed about your family collapses. I felt betrayed, yes, but also complicit, as if some part of me had known all along. I started remembering the small things. The extra chair at the table when I was very young. My mother's sudden hatred of lullabies. My father's rule that the attic was always locked. Even the way she'd flinch when I mentioned my friend from the vent. I tried to imagine what they'd told themselves to justify it. Maybe they called it an accident. Maybe they thought if they buried it deep enough, the truth would stay quiet forever. I can still see my father standing in that doorway, telling me to stop crying, to use the quiet room until I learn control. I wonder if he said those same words to Jonas first. The local paper ran a story about it for a week. Child's remains found in Odin's home. Neighbors expressed shock. They seemed like a good family, one woman said. But I remembered her, the same neighbor who once asked about the strange noises. My mother told her it was just the pipes. I don't think anyone wanted to look closer back then. When the police asked if I wanted to claim the remains, I said yes. I don't even know why. Maybe guilt? Maybe instinct? I arranged a small burial at the edge of town. No one came except me and the detective. The coffin was tiny, barely larger than a suitcase. I placed that rusted toy car inside before they lowered it. It felt like closing a door that had been open too long. Afterward, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the hotel. I walked the streets until dusk, ending up by the river where I used to skip stones as a boy. That's when it hit me, the reason the quiet room always smelled faintly like metal and earth. They must have done it while I was outside playing. Maybe they sent me out on purpose. Maybe I heard something that day and forgot. Or chose to forget. Weeks passed before I stopped seeing that room in my dreams. Even now, sometimes, I wake up thinking I can hear faint tapping behind a wall. My therapist says it's trauma echoing through memory, that my mind is trying to piece together lost years. But deep down, I know what I heard wasn't memory, it was something alive in that house for far too long. I sold the property to the city. They turned it into a small park eventually. I visited once, standing near the spot where the quiet room used to be. Children played nearby, shouting, laughing so free it almost hurt to listen. One little boy tripped and started crying, and his mother ran to him immediately, holding him close. I don't know why, but I had to walk away then. Sometimes I wonder what kind of man I'd be if that room had never existed. If Jonas had lived, maybe he would have been the loud one, the brave one. Maybe I wouldn't have grown up afraid of my own voice. But more than anything, I wonder if my parents ever looked at me and saw him instead. I think about how they named that place the quiet room, like silence was something holy. Maybe that's why it still haunts me, because silence was never peace, it was a grave, and I spent my whole childhood learning how not to make a sound in it. I remember the sound more than anything else, the way the violin screeched under my father's hand when he didn't like how I played. He'd grab it from me, grip it too tight, and the strings would cry. He said music was supposed to come from pain, and maybe that's why I learned to play like my life depended on it, because it did. He wasn't a bad man to the world. He taught at the conservatory, wore iron shirts, smiled for neighbors. But when the door shut behind him, he turned into something else. I was 8 when he decided I'd be a prodigy. By 12, I could play Paganini blindfolded, but if my finger slipped, even for a heartbeat, I'd feel the sting of his baton on my wrist. "Discipline, Helena," he'd whisper. "The world applauds perfection, not excuses," he never shouted. That made it worse. His voice stayed calm, his words deliberate, and that quiet tone made me desperate to please him. I thought if I played well enough, maybe he'd stop watching me with that look, the one that measured my worth by the tremble of a bow. I never told anyone. Not the other students, not my mother, who left when I was 10. She'd tried once to take me with her, but he'd said I belonged to music, not to her. I didn't understand what that meant until I found the locked drawer in his study filled with tapes. Recordings of me practicing. He'd whisper corrections over them, over and over, like prayers. My name written neatly on each label. Helena, Etude 14. Helena, Nocturne 2. I felt sick listening to my younger self crying through scales. That night, I broke one of the tapes. The next day, he broke my bow. When the conservatory announced a competition in Munich, he told me it would be my rebirth. I didn't know what he meant, but his eyes looked different, soft around the edges, almost proud. "If you win," he said, "we'll never need to speak of the past again." But I didn't want a clean slate. I wanted out. Still, I nodded. I always nodded. He made me practice 8 hours a day for 3 months. My fingers bled, and he said that was good. It meant my body was learning. I began to play automatically, detached from the sound. The violin became an extension of fear. 3 days before the competition, I overheard him on the phone. He was telling someone, if she fails again, she'll have to start over completely. That word again haunted me. Again, like this wasn't the first time he'd said it about someone. I thought of the tapes. How many names had been erased before mine? I didn't ask. I didn't dare, but I stopped sleeping. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at my violin on the chair, wondering what he saw when he looked at me, a daughter or a project. The night before the performance, he came into my room without knocking. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "you must give them everything. Every drop of pain, every note of your soul. Do you understand?" I nodded, pretending not to notice the glass of water trembling in his hand. He placed my violin beside me and brushed my hair away from my face. "You're almost perfect, Helena," he whispered. "Almost." Then he left. I didn't move for a long time. The moonlight was spilling across the strings, and something in me broke. I got up and went to the workbench in the hallway. That's where he kept his repair tools, razor blades, wires, clamps. I picked up a thin steel string meant for replacements, sharper than it looked. I don't know what I planned to do at first. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. I replaced the horsehair on my bow with that wire. It sliced my finger when I tightened it, but I didn't stop. The pain made me feel real again. Morning came, and we drove to Munich in silence. He wore his usual gray suit. I sat beside him, clutching my violin, smelling the varnish and resin like it could choke me. At the concert hall, I waited backstage while he stood near the curtains, watching me like a conductor ready to cue his puppet. When they called my name, Helena Weiss, performing Sarasate Zigeunerweisen, I walked out, and the lights hit me like judgment. The audience blurred into a single breathing thing. I could feel my father's stare in the dark corner of the hall. My fingers found the strings by habit. I began to play. The first notes came clean, sharp, almost flawless. The judges nodded. My father's face softened. But halfway through, when the melody rose and twisted into the part he called the moment of truth, something inside me snapped. The wire caught the light as I drew it across the strings, and the sound changed. It wasn't music anymore. It was a scream. A high, tearing shriek that vibrated through the room like pain-given voice. I felt the metal bite my fingertips, slice my thumb. Blood ran down the neck of the violin, into the hollow. I kept playing. Each stroke cut deeper, both into the strings and into me. I could see people in the audience shifting uncomfortably, whispering. My father stood up. I met his eyes, and for the first time, I didn't stop. I pressed harder, forcing the wire to shriek louder, until one of the strings snapped and whipped my hand open. I let it. The bow broke in two. I held the jagged end and struck the violin once, hard. The wood cracked. Security rushed in, but I didn't care. The last sound that instrument ever made was a thin, dying whimper. My father reached the stage first. He grabbed my wrist, but I pulled away, smearing his sleeve with blood. "This is the only song you taught me," I said. He didn't answer. He just stared, mouth trembling. They led me off stage, and I remember the paramedic asking my name. I said it like it belonged to someone else. They called it a breakdown. Reporters wrote about the prodigy's collapse under pressure. My father told them I'd been ill, exhausted. He smiled for the cameras again, that perfect, polite smile. But at home, he didn't speak for days. He locked himself in the study, probably listening to his tapes. I waited. I waited for anger, for punishment, but it never came. Then one night, I woke to the sound of the violin, again soft, distant, like a ghost. I followed it to his study. The door was open, and he was sitting there, playing my cracked violin. Bloodstains still marked the wood. He was whispering as he played, almost perfect, over and over. He didn't look up when I stepped inside. I wanted to scream, but something in me stayed still. Maybe I'd used up all my screams on that stage. I turned and left the house barefoot. I didn't take the violin. I didn't take anything. I walked until morning. I was 15 then. I stayed with a teacher from the conservatory who helped me get a place in the city. My father didn't look for me. He didn't have to. He had his recordings, his ghost of a daughter trapped in sound. I found work at a music store, tuning other people's violins. I avoided the stage for years, but sometimes, late at night, I'd hear that wire sound again in my head, the way it split the air like truth. Years passed. I thought maybe he'd died. Then last spring, I got a letter. It had no return address, but I knew the handwriting immediately. Inside was a cassette tape, just one word written on the label. Finale. My hands shook when I put it into the player. The first thing I heard was breathing slow, unsteady. Then the sound of my old violin, strings slightly off tune. He played the same piece, Zigeunerweisen, but slower, broken. Halfway through, the bow hit a wrong note, and he whispered, "Forgive me, Helena." Then silence. Police later told me the neighbors heard the violin stop mid-song. When they went in, they found him slumped in the chair, the same wire stretched across the bow, his fingers cut open. They called it an accident. I didn't argue. I went back to Munich for the first time last month. The concert hall had changed, but the stage still smelled of wood polish and dust. I stood where I'd once bled and watched a young girl rehearse with her mother. The mother smiled, soft and proud, and I almost cried with relief. Then the girl's bow slipped, and her mother gently corrected her posture. "Try again," she said. Not an order, just a nudge. That's when I realized what I'd been chasing all these years. It wasn't revenge, or closure, or even freedom. It was the chance to play without fear. I still have that wire. I keep it in a glass case, coiled like a memory. Some nights, I take it out and run my thumb along it, feeling the faint scar that never healed. It reminds me that perfection is a cage disguised as praise. I never played on stage again, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I take out a violin and let my fingers drift over the strings. The notes come soft, imperfect, human, and for the first time, I think he'd hate it, which makes me smile. When I first arrived at the house, she hugged me too tightly. I remember her perfume, faint lavender, and something old, maybe dust or paper, and the way she whispered my name like she was testing it. "Taro," she said softly, then louder, "My sweet Taro." But that wasn't my name. My name was Ren. The social worker had corrected her, but she didn't seem to hear. She smiled in that distracted, shaky way people do when they're trying not to cry. I was 12 then, small for my age, quiet, the kind of kid who didn't ask for much. So I just nodded when she said it again. "Welcome home, Taro." The first night in that house in Nagano felt strange. Everything was spotless, too organized. Every shelf, every toy, every photo frame looked like it had been frozen in time. She had prepared a room for me, bright blue walls, posters of soccer teams, and a nameplate on the door that read Taro's room. The social worker told her she'd let me decorate it later, but the woman just smiled and said, "Oh, he already loves it this way." I didn't say anything. I was tired, and honestly, I'd been through worse foster homes. I told myself she was just being affectionate. I had no idea what I was walking into. The next morning, she made me pancakes with a chocolate smiley face on top. She told me how proud she was that I'd slept through the night just like before. When I asked what she meant, she said, "You used to have bad dreams, but it's good they've stopped." I didn't understand, so I just nodded and ate. Later, she showed me a box of clothes, old shirts, small jackets, shoes half a size too big. "They're all yours," she said. "You left them here before, remember?" I looked at her, unsure if she was joking. "I just got here," I said carefully. Her smile didn't change. "Of course," she whispered. "You just got back." That week, she started teaching me routines: wake up at 6, brush teeth twice, fold the blanket neatly. Every time I slipped up, she'd sigh and say, "Taro never used to forget this." When I told her again that my name was Ren, she froze, just for a second, then said, "Don't be silly. You've always been Taro." There was no anger in her tone, just confusion. Like she genuinely believed it. I wanted to call the social worker, but the landline didn't work, and she said she didn't have a cell phone. "Too many waves in the air," she said once with a nervous laugh. "They make my head hurt." A few days later, she took me to a local school to register. When the teacher asked my name, the woman jumped in before I could speak. "Taro Sakamoto," she said proudly. The teacher smiled at me. "You're back? It's been years." My stomach tightened. Everyone seemed to know the name. I didn't correct them. I didn't want trouble. But that day after class, I asked one of the kids, "Who was Taro Sakamoto?" The boy looked at me like I was crazy. "That's you," he said. "You used to live here before the accident." Then he whispered, "Didn't you die?" and laughed awkwardly before running off. When I asked her about it that night, she dropped a plate. Her hands shook as she cleaned it up. "People gossip," she said finally. "Ignore them." But I couldn't. I found an old photo album in the living room cabinet later that night. Every page had pictures of her, and a boy, black hair, small frame, big smile. He looked exactly like me. Same eyes, same dimple on the left cheek, even the same birthmark near the ear. My chest tightened. I flipped to the last page, and there was a newspaper clipping, taped in tragic accident claims local boy, age 12. His name, Taro Sakamoto. The date, 2 years ago. I didn't sleep that night. Every time the house creaked, I thought I heard whispering her voice, maybe, saying that name. In the morning, I asked her about the pictures, trying to sound casual. She smiled faintly and said, "You loved soccer so much back then." When I pressed further, she said, "The doctors said it was normal to forget some things after trauma. It'll come back, Taro." Then she put her hand on my head like I was a doll. That's when I realized she wasn't pretending she believed it. The routines became stricter. She'd wake me at dawn to take medicine. Small white pills, she said, would help the memories return. I hid them under my tongue and flushed them when she wasn't looking. She made me recite things, birthdays, songs, even the names of people I'd never met. "Say it, Taro," she'd whisper. Say you remember the river. I'd repeat after her just to make it stop. Sometimes she'd cry afterward, clutching me like she was afraid I'd vanish. Once, she even whispered, I won't lose you again. Weeks passed like that until one night, I woke up to the sound of humming. She was sitting on the floor beside my bed, brushing my hair while whispering, my sweet boy, my brave boy. I pretended to sleep, but she kept going, talking to me as if I were someone else. You shouldn't have gone near the bridge, she murmured. I told you it wasn't safe. Then her tone shifted soft but trembling. But it's all right now. You're here. We fixed it. The next day, she took me to a little pond behind the house. You used to love feeding the koi, she said. The water was shallow, greenish, and still. I noticed a patch of freshly turned soil near the edge. When I asked, she said she'd buried something there. Memories we don't need. She smiled when she said it, and I felt a cold wave run through me. That night, I dreamed about the boy in the photo, standing by that same pond, reaching toward me, his mouth moving but no sound coming out. After that, I began searching when she was asleep. In the basement, behind old boxes, I found something that made my stomach twist, a trunk filled with clothes and photo frames. Each had a different boy's face. All of them looked like me. Underneath, I found small name tags, Haru, Kenji, Daisuke, each crossed out in black marker. Then, at the very bottom, a folder. Inside were adoption papers, dated years apart, all signed with her name. I remember my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. The most recent file mine was still open, but under it was another one, dated just a year before. The child's name was blanked out with correction, fluid, but the photo matched mine exactly. I stared until my eyes blurred. That's when I heard her voice behind me. You shouldn't be down here, Taro. I turned slowly. She was standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale and tight. What are you doing? She asked quietly. I didn't answer. I tried to put the papers back, but my hands were trembling. She came down slowly, one step at a time, never breaking eye contact. You weren't supposed to see that, she whispered. It'll confuse you. I backed away. Who are they? I asked. The others? Her voice softened. They weren't you. They tried, but they weren't you. I bolted for the stairs, but she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. You'll forget again, she said, her nails digging into my skin. You always forget. I yanked free and ran. The front door was locked. She followed, calm now, humming that same tune from before. Don't make me fix it again, she said. I remember the exact words because they chilled me. I can't keep fixing it. I ran into the kitchen, grabbed the first thing I could, a glass bowl, and threw it at the window. It shattered. I climbed through, cutting my hands on the glass, and sprinted barefoot down the road. I didn't stop until I reached the police box near the station. The officer must have thought I was crazy at first, a bleeding kid screaming about replacements and buried boys. But when they went to the house the next morning, they found her gone. The pond had been drained. Under the soil, they discovered small personal items, shoes, toys, buttons. DNA tests later confirmed 2 of them belonged to children previously reported missing from nearby towns. The woman, whose real name wasn't even Sakamoto, had changed her identity 3 times. They never found her. For months afterward, I couldn't sleep without the lights on. Every sound, a floorboard creak, a door hinge felt like her coming back for me. The social worker visited often, saying it wasn't my fault, that I was brave. But what haunted me most wasn't what she did, it was how much she believed it. How real her delusion felt. How, she said, with such tenderness, you came back to me. A year later, I was placed with a new family in Osaka. They were kind, normal. But sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I still think about that house in Nagano, the walls lined with smiles that weren't mine. Once, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for her name, but nothing, no trace. Like she never existed. Then, just last month, I got a letter. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, me, standing by the pond, the year I arrived. And written on the back in delicate handwriting, "Welcome home, Taro. Let's start again." I don't know how she found me. But last night, I heard humming outside my window. The same tune, soft, broken, and patient, as if she was waiting for me to remember who I am. When I stepped off the train in Lyon, I wasn't sure if I was more nervous or relieved. 3 years away from home, 3 years of becoming someone my mother swore didn't exist. My suitcase felt heavier than it should have been, not because of what was in it, but because I had no idea who was waiting on the other side of the platform, my mother, or the memory of her I'd been trying to forgive. When she appeared, smiling too wide and dressed in one of those floral coats she always wore to church, I almost convinced myself this might go well. Almost. She didn't hug me. She didn't even look at me for more than a second. She said, "You've grown," like she was talking to a stranger, and that was when I realized she was pretending I was one. The car ride to her house was quiet. I tried to fill the silence. I told her about Paris, about working at the cafe, about saving for a small apartment. She nodded politely, eyes fixed on the road, fingers gripping the steering wheel like she was afraid it might slip away. When we reached our street, I felt my chest tighten. Everything looked the same: the faded shutters, the crooked mailbox, the ivy creeping up the walls. But there was a new sound. Children laughing next door, someone calling out a name I recognized. "Lucy, come here, dear." The name hit me like a knife. Lucy was me, the old me. Before transition. Before I was Leah. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone else had that name. But when I stepped into the house and saw the photos on the wall, I stopped breathing. Every frame that once held pictures of me, from birthdays, school, even my first violin recital, was filled with someone else, a girl. Same hair color, same smile, but not me, not my eyes. I looked at my mother, and she said, almost cheerfully, "I thought it was time for some updates." My throat went dry. "Who is that?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just walked into the kitchen, humming like nothing had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house smelled the same lavender detergent and dust, but it didn't feel like home. I wandered into the living room and noticed new pictures on the mantel. That girl again, standing beside my mother, holding a cake. The handwriting on the frosting said, "Happy birthday, Lucy." The date was from 2 months ago. My hands trembled as I touched the glass frame. I whispered to myself, "She threw me a birthday party. For someone else." I confronted her the next morning. "Mom, who is that girl in the pictures?" I asked. She looked up from her coffee and said, "Oh, she's a friend from church, such a sweet girl. She helps me around the house." Her tone was smooth, rehearsed. I tried not to lose control, but I said, "Then why is she posing in my photos? Why is she holding my violin?" She frowned. "You gave up that part of your life, Leah. You made your choice. You can't expect everything to freeze just because you did." Her voice was sharp now, her words cutting deeper than I wanted them to. That afternoon, someone knocked at the door. My mother smiled as if she'd been waiting for it. "Ah, Lucy, you're just in time," she called. And then she appeared, the girl from the photos. She looked about my age, maybe a year younger. Her hair was cut exactly like mine used to be. She even wore a dress my mother had bought for me on my 15th birthday. She extended her hand and said softly, "Hi, I'm Lucy." My mind blanked. My mother stood behind her, smiling like a proud parent. "She's been such a blessing," she said, "almost like having you back." The room tilted. I excused myself and went upstairs, locking the door. My heart wouldn't stop pounding. I could hear them laughing downstairs, my mother asking her to stay for dinner. Through the thin walls, I could make out phrases, "You play beautifully, you remind me so much of her, it's like she never left." I pressed my hands against my ears until my nails dug into my skin. I didn't cry. I just sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. When I finally opened my eyes, it was dark outside. Their voices had quieted. I went downstairs to get some air. The dining table was still set, 2 plates half empty, candles burned low. My mother's laughter echoed faintly from the backyard. I peered through the window. There they were, sitting side by side on the porch swing. My mother brushed the girl's hair back the way she used to do mine, whispering something that made the girl smile. Then I heard it. "My Lucy." She said it so tenderly, so naturally, I felt sick. The next day, I packed my bag. I couldn't stay. I told myself I'd leave before noon, but when I went downstairs, the front door was bolted from the outside. "Mom?" I called. No answer. I ran to the back door, locked too. My phone was dead, and the charger was missing. I started to panic. I heard footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate. When I looked up, she was standing on the landing, holding the photo album I'd kept since childhood. "You shouldn't leave, Leah," she said calmly. "It's not polite to leave guests unattended." I swallowed hard. "Guests? You mean her? Why are you doing this?" She walked down, each step echoing in that narrow hallway. "Because I missed my daughter," she said simply. "And you decided to disappear." I backed away, my voice shaking. "I didn't disappear, I just became who I am." Her smile faltered. "No, you became something else, someone else, and I had to bring her back." That night, I hid in my old room. I could hear her talking downstairs, two voices again. The girl's voice was soft, uncertain. "Does she hate me?" she asked. My mother's voice was firm. "No, dear. She's confused. She doesn't realize this is better for everyone." Then, silence. A door closed. Footsteps approached my room. I shoved the dresser against the door and held my breath. "Leah," she called, her tone gentle now. "Come out, sweetheart. You can't just hide. You know, she's not pretending. She really wants to be you." I stayed quiet. My heart thudded in my ears. After a while, her footsteps faded. I waited until dawn before moving the dresser. I needed to get out. I tried the window, but the latch was sealed shut. That's when I noticed something under my bed, a shoebox I didn't recognize. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all written in my handwriting. At least, they looked like mine. Same looping strokes, same way of crossing the T's. Each one started with "Dear Mom" and ended with "Love, Lucy." My hands trembled as I read one. "I'm sorry for everything. I'll come home soon. I'll be your daughter again." I felt dizzy. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. She'd forged them or made someone else write them. Maybe that girl. Maybe both. I had to see her. I crept downstairs, careful not to make a sound. The living room was dark, but I saw the girl asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Her face looked peaceful. Almost too peaceful. I leaned closer, and something caught my eye, a small bruise on her neck, shaped like fingers. I whispered her name. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Leah," she said. My heart nearly stopped. "You know who I am?" She nodded weakly. "She told me you left. She said I could help her forget, but she hurts me when I get it wrong." Before I could reply, I heard footsteps behind me. My mother's voice cut through the dark. "Leah, what are you doing?" I turned. She was holding a kitchen knife, her face pale, almost trembling. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "You ruined everything." She was happy before you came back. I took a step back. "Mom, listen to yourself. You don't need her to replace me. I'm still your child." Her eyes filled with tears. "No, you're not. You're gone. I buried you the day you left." She raised the knife. The girl screamed. I grabbed her hand and ran. We crashed through the back door. The lock splintered under our weight. Cold air hit my face as we sprinted into the yard. I could hear my mother behind us, shouting, sobbing, calling my old name again and again. "Lucy, come back." I didn't look back. We ran until the neighbors' lights came on, until someone opened a window and yelled for us to stop. By the time the police arrived, my mother was sitting on the porch, holding that same knife, whispering my name like a prayer. They took her away that night. She didn't fight. She didn't even look at me. The officers asked questions, wrote reports, took photos of the house. They found the letters, the fake IDs, even an old file showing she'd been paying the girl's parents to lend her for weekends. They called it psychological abuse. I called it madness. The girl's real name was Camille. She went home that week. I never saw her again. I stayed in a hotel for a few days before leaving Lyon. When I checked out, the receptionist handed me a small envelope. "Delivered this morning," he said. "No return address." Inside was a photo, me as a teenager, standing with my mother in front of our house. Only, in this version, I wasn't smiling. And someone had drawn a red circle around my face. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 4 words. "Lucy belongs to me." I burned the photo that night. I thought it would end there, that I could finally leave it all behind. But sometimes, when I wake up before dawn, I swear I can still hear her voice. Not angry, not pleading, just soft, almost loving, saying the same thing she said the day I was born. My beautiful Lucy. And for a moment, I forget who I am. Then I remember. And I wish I didn't. I remember the sound before anything else, the sharp, rhythmic tapping of my father's pen against the wooden table. It meant he was watching me, measuring me again. I was 10 years old, sitting perfectly straight in a chair too tall for my legs, my hands folded exactly the way he'd shown me. He believed posture revealed the state of a man's soul. Every lesson was like that, rules and measurements and punishments disguised as love. He said he was helping me become something greater than himself. But it never felt like help. It felt like standing at the edge of an invisible cliff, waiting for the moment I'd fall just to prove I wasn't perfect. That evening, he was grading my performance for the day. Not schoolwork, but my behavior, how many times I'd smiled, how long I'd taken to respond when spoken to, how often my eyes had drifted away from his. He had a notebook filled with columns and percentages. Perfection, he said, is not a gift, it's a discipline. Weak men hide behind feelings. Strong men erase them. His voice was steady, too calm to argue with. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't trying to be weak. I just didn't understand why everything had to hurt. He gave me a mark of 78% that night. Too low. You showed uncertainty when I asked about the meal, he said. You should have said it was good. Hesitation is deceit. I didn't even remember hesitating. He sent me to my room and locked the door from the outside, saying I needed reflective time. I sat on the bed staring at the wallpaper, pale yellow squares that looked like fading chessboards. He made me stay there until morning without dinner. I was used to it by then. The next day, he introduced a new test. Eye contact endurance, he called it. We sat across from each other in the kitchen, a stopwatch between us. I had to stare into his eyes without looking away for 5 minutes. Every time I blinked or flinched, he clicked the pen on his clipboard and muttered, "Reset." I remember the veins on his hands, the twitch of his jaw, the smell of his cologne peppery and sharp. When I finally broke down and begged to stop, he leaned forward and said softly, "You can't cry your way to greatness, Lucas." I didn't realize until later how much I hated that name when he said it. It didn't sound like mine. It sounded like a project. Weeks passed in that rhythm, tests, corrections, silence. My mother had left when I was 7, though he told me she couldn't handle excellence. I didn't question it then, but I used to wonder if she'd still recognize me. I'd stopped laughing years ago, because laughter counted as emotional leakage. Everything I felt was pushed down so far that I sometimes forgot what feeling even was, until the night I found the tapes. He kept his study locked, but one afternoon, he forgot the key in his coat pocket. He was in the garden timing my running laps when I snuck inside. The room smelled like dust and burnt paper. On the shelves were rows of labeled tapes, Lucas 3.2, Lucas 5.1, Lucas 7 sleep trial. My stomach turned. I picked one and put it into the old cassette player on his desk. At first, there was static, then his voice calm, clinical. Subject displays resistance during correction sequence. Duration, 47 minutes. Crying subsided after 12. Progress satisfactory. Then, faintly, I heard my own screams. I stopped the tape, trembling so hard my knees buckled. I didn't remember any of it. He'd filmed or recorded me, experimenting on me like I was something he could redesign. I opened another tape, labeled Prototype 1, Dieter. The voice that cried there wasn't mine, it was smaller. We didn't have any relatives named Dieter. I realized with a sick certainty that I hadn't been his first experiment. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my body tense. He came into my room at midnight holding his clipboard. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin the final phase." His eyes were bright, almost joyful. "Emotional eradication. You'll thank me one day." I nodded because disagreeing wasn't allowed, but something in me broke, then not a loud crack, more like the quiet tearing of fabric. I didn't want to thank him. I wanted him to stop existing. The final phase began the next morning in the basement. He called it controlled regression. There was a single chair in the center of the concrete floor, ropes hanging loosely from its arms. He told me to sit. My hands shook as I obeyed. He explained that he would trigger regression by replaying moments from my childhood and controlling my reactions. "We'll eliminate the last traces of weakness," he said. After this, you'll be pure discipline. He started the tape machine. My own voice filled the room again, crying, begging, then silence. He stood beside me, watching for any emotion. I couldn't breathe. Every sob from those tapes felt like someone else's pain shoved into my skull. "You're not him anymore," my father said. "He was defective. You're the refined version." I looked at him then, really looked his hollow cheeks, the tightness around his mouth, the obsession in his eyes. And I realized he wasn't trying to make me better. He was trying to fix himself. When he paused to write notes, I spoke without thinking. "Did you do this to Dieter too?" The pen froze midair. His expression didn't change, but his hand twitched. "That name," he said quietly, "is forbidden." I pushed further. "Who was he?" He slammed his clipboard onto the floor and grabbed my face. "He was the beginning," he hissed. "The failure. You're the perfection." His nails dug into my skin. "Don't ruin it." I don't know what snapped first, his control or mine. I twisted away, kicked the table, and ran for the stairs. He shouted my name, his footsteps pounding behind me. The door at the top was locked. Of course it was. He kept every door locked in that house. I grabbed a wrench from the workbench and swung it at the hinges until the frame cracked. He caught my arm, shouting, "You'll undo everything," I screamed back. "I'm not your project," and swung again. The hinge gave way. I shoved him hard, and he fell backward onto the concrete. The sound his head made when it hit still echoes in my chest sometimes. I didn't stop to check if he was alive. I ran. Through the hall, past the yellow wallpaper, out into the cold air. My legs didn't feel like mine. I made it to the neighbor's house barefoot, pounding on their door until they opened. I remember their shocked faces, the way they looked past me as if expecting to see him there too. I told them he'd hurt me, that there were tapes. The police came within an hour. They found him unconscious, but alive. When they searched the basement, they discovered more than 100 tapes, notebooks filled with data, and photos of me labeled with things like anger threshold and obedience lapse. They also found an old file marked Dieter, 19 to 78. It turned out Dieter had been his biological son from a previous marriage. The boy had died at age 5. Cause of death: accidental fall. No one had questioned it back then. I spent the next few years in foster care, learning what normal even meant. People told me I was brave for surviving him, but bravery wasn't what I felt. Mostly it was confusion and guilt. I used to dream about that last moment in the basement, the look on his face when I pushed him. I'd wake up gasping, half expecting to hear that pen tapping again. When I turned 18, I went back to the house once. It had been sold, repainted, made to look ordinary. I asked the new owner if I could see the basement. He hesitated but eventually agreed. The air down there still felt heavy, like something alive was holding its breath. The chair was gone, the walls freshly plastered, but I could still see faint marks on the floor where the ropes had rubbed. I stood there for a long time, trying to remember the boy I'd been before the experiments. I couldn't. The police never charged him with murder, only psychological abuse and unlawful confinement. He was institutionalized instead of imprisoned. They said his obsession was rooted in grief-induced psychosis. That explanation always felt too clean, too small. They made it sound like a bad dream rather than a lifetime. I never visited him, but he sent letters. At first, they were apologies, written like lab reports. Error acknowledged, regret acknowledged. Later, they became incoherent scribbles, looping the same sentence. Perfection exists inside you. I burned every one. It's strange how the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Even now, decades later, I still sit too straight in chairs. I measure my words before I speak. I notice symmetry in people's faces, the way their eyes move when they lie. Sometimes, I hear myself saying things the way he used to, calm and detached, and I have to stop, breathe, remind myself I'm not him. I never had children. I don't trust the part of me that learned his lessons too well. Last month, I got a call from the institution. He died in his sleep. They asked if I wanted his belongings. I said no at first, but something inside me twisted the same mix of fear and unfinished business. I told them to send whatever they had. A small box arrived 2 days later, wrapped neatly like a gift. Inside was one thing: A single cassette labeled Lucas Final Evaluation. I stared at it for hours before finding an old player. When I finally pressed play, I expected his voice. But it was mine. A recording from that last day, right after he'd hit the floor. My voice was shaking, crying, whispering, "I'm not perfect, I'm not perfect." Then, faintly in the background, another sound, his voice, barely audible, saying, "Now you are." The tape clicked off. I sat there for a long time, trying to understand what he meant. Maybe in his mind, breaking me was the final proof of success. Maybe perfection, to him, was silence, no resistance left, no emotion, no sun. I unplugged the player and took the tape outside. The snow was falling softly, almost soundless. I buried it in the garden under a tree, pressing the earth down with my hands until they went numb. For the first time, I didn't feel like an experiment. I just felt human. I remember the sound of the pencil before I remember the sound of my own heartbeat. That sharp scratching against paper, fast, rhythmic, anxious. My father used to say that silence was the enemy of thought. So every night, our little house in Christchurch filled with that sound, mine, his, and the clock ticking behind us like a quiet reminder that sleep was for other people. I was 11 then, and I thought every kid's father sat beside them while they did homework. I didn't know that homework wasn't supposed to make you tremble. He sat across from me, elbows on the table, his glasses resting low on his nose. "Again," he'd say, tapping the page, "you're missing the motivation. Every action has a reason. Don't just describe the scene, understand it." He wasn't talking about schoolwork, he never was. The papers spread in front of me weren't math or spelling. They were about the people who died in our neighborhood over the past few years. Real names, real places. The kind of things you'd expect to read in the newspaper, not in a child's handwriting. My essays always began with, "The victim was found," because that's how he taught me to start them. The first time I questioned it, he looked up from his notes and said, "You want to be smarter than everyone else, don't you? You have to understand the world's logic, even when it's ugly." I didn't know how to argue with that. My father had been a teacher, a good one, everyone said, until he stopped working. The school called it retirement. I later heard my aunt whisper, "suspension." He'd been at home ever since, and teaching me had become his full-time project. One night, he gave me a new assignment. The paper already had a title written in his neat handwriting, Case 47, the McAuliffe Incident. I recognized the name immediately. The McAuliffes lived 3 streets over. Their son, Peter, had gone missing that month. The police said they were still searching. My father leaned back in his chair and said calmly, "I want you to write about what you think happened. Step by step, how it might have unfolded." I froze. "But Dad, they haven't found him." He smiled slightly. "That's why it's good practice. Real analysis begins before answers exist." That night, I barely slept. The words I wrote felt wrong. My pencil hesitated over every sentence like it was carving something permanent into the air. I imagined Peter's face, freckles, messy hair, and I couldn't finish the page. My father read over my shoulder, sighing as he marked the margins. "You're not thinking like him," he muttered. "Empathy is wasted if you don't understand action." When I looked at him, he was staring past me, like he wasn't seeing me at all. Like he was remembering something. Days turned into weeks. He collected every page I wrote in a thick binder, always labeled and dated. He told me it was our study. He never explained what we were studying. When I went to school, my teacher said I looked tired. I told her my father was helping me with homework. She smiled, relieved, and said, "Good for him." I wanted to tell her the truth, but something about the way my father's eyes followed me to the door every morning kept me quiet. Then one afternoon, a woman from Child Services came by. My father told me to act natural. She had kind eyes and a calm voice. She said she just wanted to see how things were going with my schooling. My father made tea. I sat at the table with my binder open, pretending to work. She asked to see my assignments. My father smiled and gestured to me. "Show her how disciplined you've become." I didn't know what else to do. I turned the binder toward her. Her smile faded after the first few pages. By the 10th, she looked pale. She flipped through more, each page covered in neat handwriting, describing hypothetical killings, patterns of behavior, imagined motives. She asked, "Who gave you these topics?" My father leaned back and said, "I did. He's gifted. He needs something challenging." Her voice dropped. "These are about real people, Mr. Collins. These are unsolved cases." He laughed quietly, which makes them all the more educational. She left with a promise to follow up soon. My father didn't speak to me that night. He just sat across from me, staring. The next morning, the phone rang, and I heard his voice turn sharp and defensive. "You people think you can tell me how to raise my son?" he snapped. When he hung up, he came to my room, holding the binder. "They don't understand," he said softly. "You do, don't you? You're different." I nodded, even though I didn't. That evening, he told me we were going for a drive. We rarely left the house together anymore. I thought maybe it meant things were okay again. We drove out past the neighborhood, past the schools, until the houses thinned and the roads got narrow. He parked near a patch of forest and told me to get out. The air smelled like damp wood and something metallic. He popped the trunk, and inside were several folders. Each had a name written on it in thick black marker. Peter McAuliffe was one of them. "Tonight," he said, "we do real research." He handed me a flashlight and one of the folders. Inside were photos, newspaper clippings, maps, handwritten notes. My heart pounded so hard I could barely see. "What are we doing here?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "We're learning patterns. This is where Peter was last seen. Observation, deduction, understanding, that's the real homework." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He walked ahead, shining his light through the trees, narrating his thoughts like a teacher in class. "He left his bike by the trail," he said. "He knew whoever it was. No signs of struggle, so it was quick. Efficient." I whispered, "How do you know that?" He didn't answer. At some point, he crouched near a tree, touching the dirt like he was looking for something. I stepped closer and saw a piece of torn fabric, half buried in the mud. He looked at it and said, "Good. You're learning to find evidence." My stomach turned. That was when I realized the binder wasn't the project I was. He was teaching me something else entirely. I ran. I didn't even think. I just turned and ran back toward the car, tripping on roots, scraping my hands. I heard him shouting my name, calm but firm, like he was still teaching a lesson. When I reached the car, I locked the doors and waited. My hands shook so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel. The headlights were still off, and in the darkness, I saw his flashlight beam moving closer. Then it went out. I don't remember starting the engine. I just remember the sound of gravel under the tires as I tore down the road, crying, not daring to look in the mirror. I stopped at the first gas station I found, ran inside, and begged the clerk to call the police. When they arrived, I told them everything: the binder, the assignments, the folders, the forest. They searched that area for days. They found several buried items: clothing, a bike, personal effects, and one human tooth. My father was arrested 2 days later. They said he didn't resist. They said he smiled when they took him away. He told the officers, "My son understands. He's the only one who does." The police later confirmed that his notes contained details about multiple local disappearances, things that hadn't been released to the public. They called it an obsession turned criminal. But they never explained how he knew so much. I stayed with relatives after that. They told me not to think about it, but that's impossible. The police kept the binder as evidence, and I tried to forget every page I'd ever written. I changed schools. I stopped writing altogether. But even now, when I close my eyes, I see that forest, the flashlight beam, the folder with Peter's name, my father's calm voice saying, "Observation, deduction, understanding." A few years later, when I turned 16, a detective asked if I wanted to see my father in prison. He said my father had been requesting it every month. I said no, but curiosity eats away at silence, doesn't it? By 18, I went. I told myself I needed closure. He looked older, but not weaker. When he saw me, he smiled like we'd just met after a normal day at school. "You've grown," he said. "Still writing?" I shook my head. "Good," he said. "You're not ready yet. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. They never found Peter's notebook, did they? I froze. He smiled wider. You know where it is. I didn't. At least, I thought I didn't. But when I got home, I found myself searching my old boxes, digging through notebooks from before everything fell apart. I opened one at random, just doodles, schoolwork, things that should have meant nothing. Then, near the back, a page I didn't remember writing, sketches of the forest trail, the tree, the torn fabric, and a single word written in my handwriting, pattern. That word still keeps me awake some nights. Because I've tried to convince myself I was just copying his lessons, just repeating what he said. But the more I look at that page, the more I notice things I couldn't have known: exact distances, soil color, details the police said only the person who was there could recall. Sometimes I wonder if he'd been teaching me all along not to analyze, but to remember. And maybe that's what haunts me most. The thought that his voice isn't gone, just quieter, whispering somewhere in the back of my mind, still grading my thoughts. He told me not to look at the cameras. Just look at me, sweetheart. He'd whisper through his perfect TV smile, his hand squeezing mine hard enough to leave bruises. I would nod, my throat tightening like it always did, the words stuck somewhere between fear and memory. I hadn't spoken since that night, since the fire, and even if I wanted to, I couldn't. My voice had gone quiet, like it had burned away with my mother's screams. They said I was lucky to survive. That's what the nurses kept telling me when I woke up in the hospital with smoke in my lungs and half my hair gone. My father sat beside my bed, eyes red and hollow, holding my hand like he was the one who'd been broken. For a while, I believed he loved me. But love doesn't look like control. Love doesn't silence you to keep his story clean. It started small. He'd bring reporters to the house after the fire, people with soft voices and expensive cameras. She's been through a lot, he'd say, brushing my hair, smiling at them. But she's strong, like her mother. They'd ask me questions I couldn't answer, and I'd write short words on the little whiteboard he gave me. Okay. Fine. Yes. He told everyone the same story, that a faulty heater had started the fire, that my mother had tried to save me but didn't make it out. But when I tried to write no one day, he erased it so fast the marker squeaked. He leaned close, whispering, "You don't remember right now, darling. The mind plays tricks after trauma. Trust me, I'll handle the truth." From then on, every interview was scripted. He'd make me practice what to write before the journalists arrived. "Smile when I talk about your mother," he'd say. "They need to see our pain. It's how we'll keep her memory alive." Except I didn't see any memory being kept alive. I saw him living off it, getting sympathy cards, donations, even a new car from the charity fund. At first, I thought maybe he was just trying to cope in his own way. Maybe all of this, the reporters, the cameras, was his way of keeping busy so he wouldn't fall apart. But then I started noticing things that didn't make sense. He'd disappear for hours at night, coming home smelling of burnt wood and whiskey. When I looked through his drawer one morning, I found a stack of envelopes, letters from insurance companies. One of them mentioned accelerant residue inconsistent with an accidental fire. Another talked about a pending investigation. That night, I dreamed of my mother again, her voice calling my name from inside the flames. I woke up crying, but when I reached for the photo on my bedside table, it was gone. He'd replaced it with one of just him and me. When the invitation for the live broadcast came, he was ecstatic. "National TV, Saoirse, they'll love us. They'll see how far we've come." He spent the whole week rehearsing me, reminding me which answers to write, how long to pause, when to smile. "This will be good for both of us," he said, adjusting my hair. "You'll make her proud." The studio was colder than I expected. Bright lights, too many people. A woman with a clipboard said, "We'll go live in 5 minutes." My father squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Remember what to say. We're family, and we survived." That's the story. When the camera started rolling, he was perfect, tears at the right moments, voice trembling when he said my mother's name. "She was the light of our lives," he said. "But Saoirse here, she's my reason to keep going." Everyone smiled at that, and I was supposed to lift the board that said, "Thank you for helping us heal." But my hand was shaking, because right behind the camera, I'd seen someone who shouldn't have been there. a woman with hair like my mother's, standing just beyond the lights. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at him. He noticed my hesitation, his grip tightening on my leg under the table. "Go on," he murmured through clenched teeth. "Lift it up, sweetheart." I looked back toward the shadows, but she was gone. And suddenly, I couldn't breathe. I dropped the board. The host tried to cover it up with a laugh, saying, "Looks like she's camera shy." But I picked up the marker and started writing something else. My father's eyes went wide. He whispered, "Don't you dare." I wrote slowly, my fingers trembling. "He's not my father." The host froze. The cameraman looked confused. Someone shouted to cut the feed, but it was live. My father snatched the board, tried to laugh it off. "She's just confused, still dealing with trauma." But I was already on my feet, the marker still in my hand, shaking, pointing it at him like it was a weapon. People rushed toward us, and everything blurred. He kept shouting that I was delusional, that I'd been through too much. But the words were already out there, streaming live to thousands of people across Ireland. That night, they took me to a hospital again. A child psychologist came to see me, a woman with kind eyes who spoke softly. "You did the right thing," she told me. "Can you tell me what you meant by that message?" I couldn't speak, but I nodded. She handed me a notebook. My hands were trembling as I wrote, "He's not the man who took me from the fire. He's the man who started it." She blinked, then asked me to explain. And once I started, I couldn't stop. I wrote everything, the smell of gasoline, the sound of my mother arguing with him, how he dragged me out of bed that night, saying we had to start fresh. I remembered hiding under the porch, watching him light the match. The way he screamed my name afterward, like he was searching for me, but I knew it wasn't out of love. The police came the next day. They searched the house and found the old insurance letters, receipts for kerosene, and even photos of the burnt remains photos he'd taken himself. They arrested him while I sat in a small office, clutching the notebook to my chest. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. Before they took him away, he turned to me and said, "You shouldn't have remembered. We could have had everything." The trial dragged on for months. He denied everything, said I'd been brainwashed by therapists, but the evidence spoke louder than either of us. When the verdict came guilty of arson and manslaughter, I felt nothing. No relief, no victory, just emptiness. I went to live with my mother's sister after that. Her house was quiet, tucked away near the sea. She gave me space, never forced me to speak. Some nights, I'd dream of the fire again, the crackling, the screaming, but it was softer now, fading. Then one afternoon, I got a letter. No return address, just my name written in his handwriting. My aunt opened it for me, and I'll never forget her face when she read it. She didn't show me what it said. She just burned it in the sink, her hands shaking. I thought it was over. But a week later, I started hearing the tapping. Soft, rhythmic knocks on my window after midnight. I told myself it was the wind. But the third night, I looked and saw him. He was standing by the garden gate, his face pale under the streetlight, just watching. My aunt called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. The next morning, the officer told us he'd escaped during transfer to another facility. For days, we didn't sleep. My aunt installed locks, cameras, alarms, everything. But he never came back. Or maybe he did, and I just didn't see him. I kept thinking about what he'd said in court. She doesn't remember right. She never does. Months passed. I started school again, tried to blend in. One day, during art class, the teacher asked us to draw our families. Everyone laughed and chatted, but when it was my turn, I drew 3 figures. A woman, a little girl, and a man standing in the flames. When the teacher asked who they were, I wrote on the corner of the page, the truth I remembered, too late. That night, my aunt found me sitting by the window, staring at the gate. She sat beside me and said softly, "He's gone, love. They found him." I looked at her, confused. "He was trying to cross the channel," she said. "They say he drowned." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something in her voice, something trembling and uncertain, made me wonder if she was protecting me again, the way everyone always had. Years have passed now. I can speak again, though my voice is still raspy, like smoke still lives in it. I tell myself I'm safe, that the past is sealed away. But sometimes, when the TV's left on late at night, I'll catch a flicker of static and hear his voice beneath it, saying, "Smile for the camera, sweetheart." And then I remember that the last thing I ever wrote on that whiteboard, before they took it away, wasn't just, "He's not my father." I'd added one more line. He said he'd come back for me when the cameras stopped rolling. I still can't forget the sound of her laugh that night. It wasn't loud or fake, just quiet and precise, like she'd practiced it. Lucia always had a polite sort of laugh, but this wasn't hers. It was my mother's. I remember turning to look at them both across the dinner table, and for the first time, I couldn't tell which one was trying to impress whom. My mother's hand rested near her wine glass, her nails painted the same deep red as Lucia's. Her hair was styled differently than usual, soft curls framing her face, the exact same way Lucia wore hers. When she caught me looking, she smiled as if nothing was off. Lucia smiled too, but hers trembled a little, just enough for me to notice. That dinner was supposed to be casual, a simple family meal a month before the wedding. Lucia had insisted it'd be nice to bond more with my mother before everything got hectic. I was happy about it at first. My mother, Angela, had been alone since my father died 15 years ago. She always said I was all she had left. But that night, her gaze lingered too long on Lucia, her compliments too specific. "You make that dress look divine, Cara," she said, sipping wine slowly. "It reminds me of one I wore when I was your age." Lucia smiled politely and thanked her, but later in the car, she said something that made my stomach tighten. She was wearing my perfume, Matteo. I smelled it when she hugged me. I laughed it off back then. I told her my mother probably just liked it and bought it herself. But Lucia wasn't convinced. Over the next few weeks, little things started piling up small, almost meaningless on their own. My mother showed up unannounced to Lucia's boutique, pretending to browse but staying for hours, asking about her makeup, her routines, her favorite foods. Once, she brought Lucia's exact brand of lipstick to dinner and reapplied it at the table. Lucia stopped mentioning it after a while, but I could tell it was bothering her. She'd tense up whenever my mother called or when I mentioned her. The week before the wedding, I noticed my mother acting rehearsed. She asked me to show her photos of Lucia's dress, just to admire it. I refused, saying it was bad luck, but she smiled faintly and said, "It's not bad luck for me, sweetheart. I just want to see what kind of woman my son is marrying." The way she said "my son" made my skin crawl a little. She started going to the same salon Lucia did, even changing her hair color slightly to match. When I told her it was strange, she brushed it off with a soft laugh. "You're overreacting. She's a beautiful girl. I'm inspired by her, that's all." 2 days before the wedding, Lucia called me in tears. She said she'd gotten an envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a photo of her and me at a cafe from months ago, but half of the picture was burned away, leaving only her side charred and black. There was a note in my mother's handwriting that read, "Don't forget who belongs where." I didn't believe her at first. I wanted to, but my mother had always been gentle, protective, even if controlling at times. When I confronted her, she looked genuinely hurt. "Matteo," she whispered, touching my face, "how could you think I'd ever harm the woman you love?" I wanted to believe her so badly. I told Lucia it must have been a prank, maybe someone jealous or angry. She didn't argue, she just went quiet, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes when I mentioned my mother's name. The night before the wedding, Lucia stayed at a hotel with her maid of honor, Sophia. I went to the villa early to make sure everything was set up, the flowers, the music, the seating. My mother offered to help and insisted on checking the guest list with me. She seemed calm, humming softly as she crossed out names she recognized. "You know," she said suddenly, "I'm glad she makes you happy. You always needed someone who understands you like I do." That line stuck in my head long after she left. At around midnight, I got a call from Sophia. She was panicked, barely coherent. She said Lucia had gone out for a walk after dinner and never came back. The hotel staff had searched the grounds, nothing. Her phone was left behind, her shoes too. The police were called within an hour. I drove there in what felt like a fog, every thought fighting the one I didn't want to have. I didn't ask my mother anything that night. I didn't even call her. I couldn't. Morning came too quickly. The wedding guests had begun arriving at the chapel before I could even process what was happening. I was sitting in a small room, my hands shaking, when my mother walked in wearing a white gown. Lucia's gown. She looked radiant, serene, her makeup perfectly done, hair in the same soft curls. For a few seconds, my brain refused to connect the pieces. I stood up slowly, my mouth dry. What are you doing?" I asked. She smiled, calm and loving, like she used to when I was a child. "There can't be a wedding without a bride," she said softly. "You deserve someone who'll never leave you." I lunged toward her, grabbed her by the shoulders, and screamed her name. "Where is she? What did you do?" Her face changed, not angry, not scared, just disappointed. "You're ruining this moment," she whispered. "I did this for us. For family." I shoved past her, ran outside, calling Lucia's name until my throat burned. Some guests saw me, confused, murmuring as my mother followed slowly, smiling at them like it was all part of the ceremony. The police were already there by then, asking questions, taking notes. I remember my mother approaching one of them, saying with perfect calmness, "My future daughter-in-law got cold feet. It's such a shame." They found Lucia's body 2 days later, in the Arno River. The official report said drowning, but the bruises around her neck told a different story. My mother was arrested after they found a torn piece of Lucia's dress in her car. She never confessed. During the trial, she sat quietly, hands folded, dressed in black, eyes only ever meeting mine. When asked why she was wearing a wedding ring at the time of arrest, she simply said, "Because I'm married to my son's happiness." The courtroom fell silent. I felt something in me die that day, something I'll never get back. She was sentenced to life in prison, but sometimes I think that punishment didn't mean much to her. In her mind, she'd already won. She'd already replaced Lucia in the only way she thought mattered. The press called it the Florence Bride case, and for months, my name was everywhere. I moved out of Italy within a year, trying to outrun the whispers. But you can't outrun something that lives in your blood. Every time I look in the mirror, I see traces of her eyes, her jawline, the same smile she used when she lied to me. A year after it all, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. I knew the handwriting immediately. Inside was a single line. "They can lock me away, but you'll always be my groom." There was something else in the envelope, a lock of hair, blonde. Lucia's hair had been dark. I don't know if she took it from her, or if it was someone else's. And I'm not sure which thought is worse. I burned the letter that night, but the smell of the paper made me nauseous. It reminded me of that burned photo Lucia got, the one I ignored. I sometimes dream of that dinner, the first night she wore Lucia's perfume. In the dream, Lucia doesn't smile. She's staring at my mother across the table. And my mother just keeps imitating every move she makes, lifting her glass, tucking her hair, matching her breaths until there's only one woman left moving. I wake up gasping, half expecting to smell that perfume in the air again. It's faint, but some nights I swear I do. They say obsession is love gone wrong, but that's too simple. My mother didn't love me like a son, she loved me like an idea she couldn't let go of. And Lucia? She was just the mirror that broke the illusion. I visit her grave every year on the day we were supposed to be married. I never bring flowers anymore. They feel too temporary, too false. I just sit there and talk to her. I tell her what I should have said sooner, that I saw the signs, that I chose not to see them, that I'm sorry for every time I defended my mother instead of protecting her. Last year, when I visited, there was a white rose already on the grave. No one knew I was coming. The caretaker said a woman in her 60s left it earlier that morning, smiling softly, saying she was just paying respects to her daughter-in-law. He described her as elegant, graceful, with light curls in her hair. My heart stopped for a moment, because that's not possible. My mother died in prison 3 years ago. I drove home in silence that day, trying to convince myself he'd mistaken someone else. But when I unlocked my apartment, that same scent filled the room again. Lucia's perfume, faint and lingering, like someone had been there moments before I arrived. I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood there in the dark, feeling the air move behind me, the familiar warmth of breath too close to my neck. And then, a whisper low, almost tender, "You should have waited for me at the altar." I first heard the piano that night when I was halfway through brushing my teeth. The sound was faint at first, just a few notes, broken and hesitant, like someone testing if the keys still worked. I froze, toothbrush in my mouth, and listened harder. My apartment sits 2 buildings away from the old Yoshida house, the one that's been locked up since 2016 after the son, Haru, disappeared. Everyone in the neighborhood used to talk about how his mother forced him to practice piano for hours every day. They said she could hear a missed note from the other end of the street. I'd grown up hearing stories like that, but I never really believed them until that night. Because that piano, her piano, was playing again. I spat into the sink, wiped my mouth, and leaned out the bathroom window. The sound was clearer now, crisp enough that I recognized the melody. Chopin's Ballade, No. 1. My father used to play that when he was still alive, and the memory of it hit me like cold water. I checked my phone. It was 1:14 a.m. No one in their right mind practiced piano at this hour, especially not in an abandoned house. I stood there for a good minute, debating whether to call the police or just mind my own business. But curiosity is a stupid kind of bravery. I put on a hoodie, grabbed my phone flashlight, and stepped outside. The Yoshida house sat behind a rusted iron gate, surrounded by bamboo that had grown wild over the years. The moment I opened the gate, the hinges let out a sharp creak, and the piano stopped. Dead silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I remember whispering, "Hello?" like an idiot. No one answered. The gate swung shut behind me, making me flinch. I shone my light toward the living room window, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement inside a curtain, shifting, maybe, or someone stepping back. My pulse picked up, and I told myself it was probably just a squatter. Still, my legs carried me forward. I wanted proof. I'd known Haru as a kid. He was a quiet boy, polite, always looking like he hadn't slept enough. His mother ran a piano school out of their home back then. Every day when I'd walk past, I could hear her shouting through the windows, counting beats, correcting rhythm, screaming things like, "Again," and "No mistakes." I remembered seeing him once through the open curtains, his hands trembling over the keys while she stood behind him with a wooden ruler. When he won that national competition, the whole neighborhood celebrated, but he never came outside. A month later, the house went dark. The mother moved away, or so they said. The story ended there, until now. I circled around the side of the house, the beam of my flashlight cutting through overgrown grass. The back door was slightly open. My throat tightened. I called out again, "Is anyone in there?" Still no answer. Against every ounce of better judgment, I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first: dust, old wood, something faintly metallic like rust. The kitchen was empty, except for a toppled chair and an upright piano near the wall. That confused me. The Yoshidas had kept the grand piano in the living room, not here. I stepped closer, tracing the keys with my flashlight. They were covered in fingerprints, fresh ones. Someone had been playing. My breath fogged up the air as I whispered, "Haru?" The silence that followed felt too heavy. Then, from the other side of the house, came the same melody, again soft, deliberate, each note perfectly placed. It wasn't coming from the piano in front of me. My stomach dropped. I followed the sound through a narrow hallway until I reached the old practice room. I could barely see through the dust on the window pane, but the outline of the grand piano was unmistakable, and someone was sitting there. A young man. His shoulders moved with the rhythm. I swear on my life, it looked exactly like Haru. My hand trembled as I tried to push the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. I banged once, shouting, "Hey!" The music didn't stop. I tried looking through the side gap of the door, but all I could make out was that same posture I'd seen years ago, rigid, perfect, mechanical. I pulled back and realized my flashlight was flickering. For a moment, the sound of the piano faltered, just one missed note, and I heard something else behind it. A voice. Faint. Whispering. I leaned closer and realized it wasn't coming from Haru. It was behind me. I turned around fast, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, yet I could feel someone standing too close, like breathing on the back of my neck. Then a sharp, rhythmic tapping started, tap, 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 like a ruler, striking wood. The same sound his mother used to make when correcting tempo. My chest tightened. I backed away, still facing the door. The piano stopped again. This time, I heard a single, soft sob from inside. Then silence. I ran. I didn't even remember crossing the yard. I only realized I was outside when I tripped over the gate and fell onto the pavement. My hands were scraped, bleeding slightly. I sprinted home, slammed my door, and stayed up the rest of the night staring at my window. No sound came after that. The next morning, I convinced myself I must have imagined it. Grief, nostalgia, maybe just my mind filling in gaps from childhood memories. That's what I told myself. Until the following week. It was a Sunday evening when my neighbor, Mrs. Ito, knocked on my door holding a plastic tray of mochi. Her hands shook slightly as she said, "Did you hear it again last night?" I frowned. "Hear what?" She looked pale. "The piano. It was so loud I thought someone broke in again." I tried to act casual, but my heart started pounding. "You heard it too?" She nodded, lowering her voice. "You should stay away from that house." They said the mother came back. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I sat by the window, staring at the Yoshida house. No lights, no movement. Just quiet. And then, at exactly 1 a.m., the first notes of Chopin began again, flawless, beautiful, and horribly precise. I don't know what came over me, but I started recording it on my phone. The audio came out perfectly clear. When I played it back, I realized something was wrong. Beneath the piano, there was a faint second layer of sound, a voice counting, 1, 2, 3, 4. Again. 1, 2. The next morning, I took the recording to the local police station. The officer on duty, an older man, frowned when I mentioned the Yoshida name. "That house has been sealed for years," he said. "No power, no access. We've had kids break in before, but it's empty." I played him the audio. He listened silently, then said, "I'll send someone to check." I waited outside while they went in. When they came out, the officer's face was unreadable. "No one's inside," he said, "but we found something odd." He showed me a photo on his phone, handprints on the piano keys, small ones, and streaks of dried blood. I didn't go near the house for months after that. Life returned to normal, more or less, until last spring. The city finally decided to demolish the Yoshida property. I watched from my window as workers carried out furniture, debris, old music sheets. On the third day, one of the workers came over to my gate. He looked uneasy and said, "You live nearby, right? You knew the family?" I nodded cautiously. He rubbed the back of his neck. "We found something strange inside the piano frame." He paused, glancing back at the site. There was a small skeleton in there, wrapped in fabric, looked like a child. I felt the air leave my lungs. "That's impossible," I whispered. Haru was 17. The man shook his head. "This one's smaller. Maybe 10. They called the authorities. The demolition stopped for investigation, and soon the media flooded the street. The forensics team confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The remains weren't Haru's. They belonged to a much younger child. A DNA test later revealed the truth. Haru had a twin brother, one no one ever knew existed. Everything began to make sense in a horrible way. The neighbors always heard 2 sets of footsteps when Haru practiced. His mother's obsession wasn't just about perfection, it was about competition. She had forced the brothers to play against each other until one became flawless. And when the weaker one faltered, she punished him. Permanently. The other boy, the winner, must have been forced to keep practicing beside his brother's body. When he vanished after the competition, maybe he ran. Or maybe she didn't let him. 2 weeks after the discovery, I woke up around midnight again. I didn't want to, but habit made me listen. No piano this time. Just wind. I turned off the lights and tried to sleep. That's when I heard a single note middle C played softly, like a fingertip brushing the key. I sat up, heart pounding. It came again, slower, deliberate. I went to the window. The house was gone now, just an empty lot. Yet the sound was there, perfectly centered, exactly where the piano used to stand. I pressed record on my phone and whispered, "If someone's there, stop playing." The note stopped. My hands trembled. I whispered again, "If this is Haru, please, just rest." A pause. Then one final sound, a low chord, dissonant, almost angry. And then silence forever. It's been a year since then. The land is still empty, no one will buy it. Sometimes, when I walk past, I swear I hear faint humming scales, arpeggios, the kind you do when warming up before practice. I keep my head down and walk faster, because now I know the truth. It was never about a haunting. It was about a cycle, one that began with obsession and ended with silence. And every time I hear a piano, even a good one, I flinch. Because I can still feel that ruler tapping behind me, counting time that never really stopped. It started the morning after Mother's Day. I remember sitting at my desk in class, tracing the edge of my notebook while Miss Saunders handed back our weekend homework. Everyone was laughing about their gifts for their moms, flowers, breakfast in bed, handmade cards. When it was my turn, I said, I made a card too. I didn't tell them I'd spent half the night perfecting it. The paper was pale pink, folded unevenly, with a drawing of me and Mom under a tree. I wrote, "Thank you for being my everything," in blue pen. She cried when she read it. Not the happy kind of crying, just silent tears that fell while she kept smiling. I thought it was strange, but she hugged me and said, "You have such a beautiful way with words, Anna." By Monday, everyone was talking about the letters again. Anonymous ones had been showing up around our small Calgary suburb for months, tucked under windshield wipers, slid through mail slots, pinned to bulletin boards. The letters always revealed secrets. The butcher cheating on his wife, the librarian pocketing overdue fines, even a teacher having an affair with a student's parent. The handwriting was neat, almost childish, written in blue pen. I remember my friend Leah whispering, "My mom says whoever writes them must be possessed. Nobody just knows things like that." At recess, a group of girls surrounded me near the swings. "Hey, Anna," one of them said, "did you write those letters?" I laughed because it sounded ridiculous. I was 10. I didn't even know most of the adults in town. But then one girl pulled a crumpled sheet from her pocket. "Look," she said, holding it next to a page from my notebook. The handwriting was nearly identical, the same rounded loops, the same wide spacing. I froze. I hadn't seen the letter before, but something about it made my stomach twist. It said, "The woman at 12 Maple Lane isn't her daughter's real mother." I ran home that afternoon, faster than I ever had. Mom was in the kitchen, slicing strawberries. I blurted, "Did you tell anyone what I wrote on your card?" She looked confused, then smiled. "No, sweetheart. Why?" I told her about the letter. She went completely still. Her hand tightened around the knife. "That's just gossip, Anna," she said softly. "Don't bring other people's filth into this house." I nodded, but my heart was racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The blue pen I'd used to make her card was still on my desk. I picked it up and wrote my name on scrap paper. The letters looked the same as the ones from town. The next morning, 2 police officers came to the school. They asked everyone to write a few sentences so they could compare handwriting. My hands shook so badly that my paper tore. When Miss Saunders collected them, I felt her eyes linger on mine. By lunch, whispers followed me everywhere. "She's the one," someone hissed. "The freak who knows everything." I went home sick, clutching my stomach, certain everyone could see the guilt I didn't even understand. That evening, Mom was waiting in the living room. Her face was pale, her eyes red. "They came here," she said quietly. "The police. They think you wrote those letters." My throat went dry. "But I didn't," I shouted. "I swear, I didn't." She reached forward and grabbed my wrists, hard enough to hurt. "Then tell me," she demanded. "How do they know about Maple Lane?" I didn't even know what Maple Lane was. I told her that. She stared at me for a long time. Then her grip loosened. "You need to stop writing things," she whispered. "Promise me." I promised. But that night, while lying in bed, I heard something from the hallway, a soft scraping sound. When I peeked through the crack in my door, Mom was sitting at the dining table, my pink Mother's Day card in front of her. She was copying my handwriting on another sheet of paper, muttering as she wrote. I couldn't see what she was writing, but her hand moved fast, frantic. Every few seconds, she'd stop and whisper, "Beautiful words, Anna. You always know just what to say." I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, she was back to normal, smiling, making pancakes, humming like nothing had happened. But on my way to school, I noticed a folded letter pinned to the lamppost by our driveway. It said, "The girl at 9 Willow Court doesn't know the truth about her mother. My address. My house." I ripped it down before anyone could see. My hands trembled as I shoved it into my backpack. At school, things were worse. Miss Saunders called me to her desk. "Anna," she said gently, "I've known you a long time. I don't believe you'd do something cruel. But these letters, people are scared." I didn't know what to say. I just cried. That night, I showed Mom the letter from the lamppost. For a moment, I thought she'd deny it. Instead, she started crying again, the same silent tears as before. "They're turning this on us," she said. "They want to take you away from me." Then she tore the letter to pieces and burned it in the sink. Days passed, and the letters didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. One exposed a police officer for covering up an accident. Another revealed that Miss Saunders's husband had a second family in Edmonton. The whole town was unraveling, and every single letter was written in that same innocent blue pen. I tried to stay quiet, to keep my head down, but it didn't matter. One morning, our mailbox was overflowing pages and pages of letters, all addressed to my mother. The top one said, "She took someone else's child and called her own." When I confronted her, she didn't yell this time. She just looked at me like she was trying to memorize my face. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked. "You were too little." My voice barely worked. "Remember what?" She went to her room and came back with an old photo album. The first pages were of her and my dad smiling, holding a baby. But then the baby looked different. The clothes were the same, but the face changed slightly from one picture to another. "That's not you in the first ones," she said. "Our daughter died when she was 2. You came to us a few months later. They said your mother couldn't keep you." I couldn't breathe. "Who gave me to you?" I asked. Her voice broke. "I don't know. They just left you with a note that said, 'Please love her.'" I stepped back. "So the letters are true?" She shook her head fiercely. No, they're lies. Someone wants to destroy what we have." She grabbed my hands again. "You're mine now. That's all that matters." That night, I packed a small bag. I didn't plan to run away exactly, just to clear my head. But when I reached the door, Mom was standing there in her nightgown, holding the blue pen. "You can't leave," she said. "Not when everyone's watching." I tried to push past her, but she caught my arm. "You wrote those letters, Anna," she whispered. "Even if you don't remember, you did it in your sleep. I found the pages under your bed." I froze. "That's not true." She smiled sadly. "It's okay. I helped you finish them." I yanked free and ran to my room. There, scattered across my floor, were dozens of sheets of paper covered in my handwriting, except I hadn't written them. Each letter exposed a different person, each ending with the same sentence. "We know what you did." My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I ran to the window, but outside, I saw flashlights moving up the street. Police, neighbors, someone had called them again. Mom's voice came from the hallway. "They'll never believe me, Anna. But they'll believe you." She sounded calm, too calm. When the officers knocked on the door, she went to answer. I heard her tell them, "She's not well. She's been writing things she doesn't understand." They took me to the station for questioning. I kept saying I didn't write the letters, but they showed me samples. Every curve, every loop matched my own. After that day, everything changed. I was sent to live with distant relatives while they investigated. Mom visited once. She brought me cookies and a new pink card. On the front, she'd written, "We'll be together soon." I noticed the blue pen again, tucked neatly into her bag. I didn't say anything. Weeks later, the police came to see me again. They said Mom had confessed, but only to some of it. She claimed she wrote the first few letters to teach the town a lesson, but she insisted I had written the rest. They found notebooks hidden behind her dresser, full of my copied handwriting. She'd practiced it thousands of times. "You have such a beautiful way with words," one note read, written beside a photograph of me at 5 years old. They told me she was taken to a psychiatric facility. I didn't cry. I just stared at the photo they showed me of the letters spread out on her kitchen table. Every single one signed, from Anna. Years have passed since then, but sometimes I still get mail from Calgary. No return address, just folded paper inside, written in blue pen. The first one said, "You always knew how to tell the truth." The second, "They'll never take you away again." Last week, One arrived at my apartment here in Edmonton. It only said, "Happy Mother's Day, sweetheart. You have such beautiful handwriting." It started the night I went into his room without knocking. Marcus was my little brother. At least that's what I had believed for as long as I could remember. He was quiet, pale, and always kept his things neatly folded, which was strange for an 8-year-old. That night, I needed a stapler for a school project. I pushed open his door, and he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, whispering to the wall. When he turned around, his face went blank, like I'd caught him doing something forbidden. He said, "You're not supposed to come in here." His tone wasn't angry, it was rehearsed, almost like he was repeating a line someone had taught him. I told him I just needed the stapler, but he stood up too quickly and blocked my path. I remember the way his hand trembled as he pointed to the door and said, "Mom doesn't like when people move my things." I laughed, thinking he was being dramatic, but when I glanced at the corner of his room, I saw something taped to the inside of his wardrobe door, a photo, folded and yellowing. I couldn't make it out before he slammed the door shut. I didn't think much of it then, but that was the first time I noticed that everything about Marcus, his routines, his drawings, even his bedtime stories, seemed out of sync with mine. A few weeks later, I was cleaning the attic with my mom. She was in one of her usual moods, snapping at dust and muttering under her breath about how order keeps us safe. I found a box labeled M's Baby Things. I thought it was for Marcus, but when I lifted the lid, the clothes inside were far too small for any boy I'd ever known. Pink booties, a floral blanket, and a tiny silver bracelet engraved with a girl's name, Annette. My mother saw what I was holding and froze. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she said, in this eerily calm voice, "Put that back. That's not yours." When I asked who Annette was, she smiled too widely and said, "Just a mistake from before you were born." The way she said it made my stomach twist. That night, I tried to ask my dad, but he just said, "Your mother doesn't like to talk about old things." That was always his answer to everything. Marcus started having nightmares around that time. I'd wake up to him crying in the next room, whispering names I didn't recognize. Once, I heard him say, "Please, I want to go home." I thought he meant downstairs, so I went to comfort him, but he clung to me like I was a stranger. "Don't tell them," he said. "They'll take you too." His eyes were wide and desperate. I remember feeling this cold panic in my chest, half fear, half confusion, because his words didn't sound like something a child would make up. The next morning, Mom told me not to talk to him about his dreams. She said he was emotionally delicate and that my curiosity could trigger his condition. That word condition stuck with me. It made him sound like a patient, not a brother. It wasn't until school asked for our birth certificates for a trip that I really started putting things together. Mom said she'd handle it, but when the forms were due, she couldn't find Marcus's papers. "They must have been misplaced when we moved from Haapsalu," she said, "except we'd never lived in Haapsalu. I knew that for a fact. I'd been born and raised in Tallinn, and we hadn't moved once." That night, I searched through the same attic boxes again, careful not to wake anyone. I found a brown envelope wedged behind a stack of photo albums. Inside were newspaper clippings. The first headline I saw said, "Missing Child. 8-year-old boy vanishes from playground." The date was from 7 years earlier, and there was a black and white photo of a boy who looked almost exactly like Marcus. Same eyes, same crooked front tooth. His name was Tarmo Saar. My hands went numb. I flipped through the other clippings, appeals from his parents, police sketches, even a reward notice. Every one of them showed the same child who slept in the next room of my house. I remember going to the bathroom and locking the door, sitting on the floor with those papers spread around me. I couldn't breathe properly. Every memory I had of him suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. His first day of school. His favorite cereal. The time he fell off his bike, all of it. Rehearsed, planted, made to look real. I wanted to scream, but instead, I just sat there until my legs went numb. In the morning, I tried to act normal. I watched my parents at breakfast, wondering how they could look so calm. Dad read his newspaper. Mom sliced apples. Marcus sat between them, quiet as ever. When he glanced up at me, I swear he knew I'd found out. There was something pleading in his eyes. I skipped school that day and went to the public library. I searched for the missing boy's name, and there it was: Tarmo Sar, age 8, disappeared, 1985, last seen near Kadriorg Park, no leads. The case had gone cold. His parents had moved away the next year. I copied down their old address on a scrap of paper and walked home in a fog. That evening, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I waited until my parents were watching TV and pulled Marcus into my room. I showed him one of the clippings I'd stolen from the attic. His face went white. "That's me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head. "They told me my parents didn't want me anymore, that you were my new family." He looked down, and his hands were shaking. "But sometimes I dream about a woman calling my name, not Marcus, something else. I think it's her." I told him we could fix it, we could tell someone. But the panic that hit his face when I said that still haunts me. "You don't understand," he said. "They'll hurt us if we do." He meant Mom and Dad. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything: the move that never happened, the missing documents, Mom's strange possessiveness. I realized I didn't really know where Marcus had come from. The next morning, I pretended to go to school, but instead took a bus to the old address I'd found. The house looked abandoned, but there was an old woman sweeping the porch. When I asked if she knew the Sars, she froze mid-motion. Then she whispered, "You're not with them, are you?" I didn't understand, but she invited me inside. The walls were covered with fading photographs. In one of them, I saw the boy again, Tarmo, with a woman who looked exhausted but kind. "That's my son," she said quietly. "He was taken from us when he was 8. No one believed what I saw. A man and a woman in a gray car." My throat went dry. She asked why I was asking, and I told her everything: my brother, the box, the clippings. She cried without making a sound. Then she grabbed my hands and said, "You have to tell someone. They can't keep doing this." When I got home that evening, the front door was unlocked. The house felt different, quieter, heavier. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, the clippings spread out in front of her. "You've been very busy," she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was calm, almost proud. "Do you know how hard we worked to make this family real?" I told her she was sick, that Marcus deserved to know who he was. She smiled faintly. "He was dying in that park, cold and alone. We saved him. We made him better." I asked her if she'd taken others before him. She didn't answer right away. "We only ever wanted one that would stay." That sentence made my blood run cold. Dad walked in then, holding a small suitcase. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "We have to go," he said. Mom stood up slowly and said, "We can't, she knows." Marcus came down the stairs crying, clutching the photo I'd shown him. "I don't want to go," he said. My dad looked at me with something like regret. "You shouldn't have dug into this." Then he grabbed Marcus by the arm, but the boy pulled away and ran out the door. I chased him into the street, yelling his name. He darted between parked cars, and then there was a screech of brakes. When I reached him, he was lying still on the pavement, blood pooling beneath his head. My parents didn't run to him, they just stood at the doorway, frozen. Someone called an ambulance, but it was too late. I remember holding his hand and whispering, "You're free now." He didn't answer. The police questioned us for days. Mom said it was an accident, that he'd been her adopted son. But when they searched the house, they found falsified papers, old photos with different children, and letters addressed to families whose kids had gone missing years apart. My parents were arrested. I was taken into state care. Months later, a detective told me the truth. Marcus Tarmo had been missing for 7 years when they found him living with us. His real parents had moved abroad, but they came back to identify him. The funeral was quiet, private. I wasn't invited. I sometimes dream of him calling my name, not with fear, but with relief. I still live in Tallinn, in a small apartment overlooking the same street where he died. I've never changed my last name. Some nights, I catch myself wondering whether my parents ever really believed they were saving those children, or if they just needed to fill something broken in themselves. The hardest part is knowing I was part of it, even if I didn't mean to be. I was the sister who smiled in the photos, who helped him learn his new name, who called him brother, while his real mother prayed for a miracle. And sometimes, when I walk past the park where he was taken, I still hear a child's voice behind me whisper, "Don't tell them." I remember the first time I realized something was wrong with the way I lived. It wasn't during one of Mum's morning checks, or even when I caught her measuring my temperature for the 4th time in an hour. It was when I found out she'd installed a new lock on the front door. From the inside, a bolt I couldn't open. She told me it was for my safety, that I sometimes wandered in my sleep. But I'd never sleepwalked in my life. Still, I nodded. I always nodded. That's what you do when you've been told since childhood that the air outside could kill you. Every day followed a routine. She'd wake me at 8, bring in oatmeal, pills, and a glass of orange juice that always tasted faintly metallic. "For your immune system," she'd say. I'd spend the morning reading, sometimes sketching in my journal. At noon, she'd open the curtains a little, just enough light to make me squint, never enough to see out. "UV rays can trigger your symptoms," she reminded me whenever I reached for the window latch. I'd never seen the full street, never heard children playing, never even smelled rain directly. It all came through her, the world reduced to filtered updates and stories. I accepted it, mostly. But on that particular afternoon in March 2008, while she was on one of her shopping trips, I noticed something strange. I'd knocked over her medicine tray while dusting the cabinet. Beneath it, a folded piece of paper slipped out a medical form with my name, birth date, and a hospital logo I didn't recognize. The words "discharged," "stable," "no pathology found" were printed across the bottom. No pathology, no illness. My stomach flipped. I dug deeper into the drawer, heart racing, pulling out more papers. Prescriptions that were never filled, appointment notes marked, "canceled by Guardian," even a handwritten list labeled "Observation Schedule, Subject 002. I stared at that line for a full minute, not breathing. Subject 002. That wasn't my name. When I heard the front door open, I shoved everything back and sat down, pretending to read. She came in humming, her usual sing-song tone. "Did you take your midday pills, darling?" she asked, scanning the counter. My throat felt dry. "Yeah," I muttered. She smiled, but her eyes lingered too long on the cabinet. Later, when she went to make tea, I noticed her hand tremble slightly as she reached for the kettle. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the documents in my head. The cold detachment of Subject 002. If I wasn't sick, what was she treating me for? The next morning, I tested her. "Mum," I said casually, spooning cereal. "What did I have again?" "The doctors said it was immune something." She froze mid-stir. "Autoimmune myelitis," she said, voice perfectly flat. "It affects your nerves." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just wondering." Her gaze didn't leave mine. "You're not thinking of anything foolish, are you?" she asked softly. "We've worked so hard to keep you safe." I shook my head quickly. "No, of course not." But I could tell she didn't believe me. Over the next week, she hardly left the house. She started sleeping in the armchair outside my bedroom, claiming she felt anxious lately. Once, I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of her whispering into the phone downstairs. "He's getting curious," she said. "Yes, I'm keeping notes." My pulse pounded in my ears. Who was she talking to? I waited until she went out to the garden one morning and searched the kitchen again. This time, I checked under the floorboard near the sink where she kept her old recipe box. There, beneath yellowed paper and faded photographs, I found a black binder marked Control Group, Parental Behavioral Study. Inside were pages of printed surveys, daily logs, and notes in her handwriting. Subject 002, limited exposure, progressing well, emotional stability decreasing slightly, maintain compliance through affection reinforcement. My breath caught. She'd been studying me. Not just raising me, studying me. The last entry, dated 2 days earlier, read, "Beginning to suspect breach. Prepare sedatives if necessary." My hands shook so badly the binder nearly slipped. I snapped it shut just as I heard footsteps. She appeared in the doorway, smiling faintly. "What are you doing?" "Looking for biscuits," I said, forcing a laugh. Her gaze darted to the floorboard. She stepped closer, too close. "You shouldn't be walking barefoot. The floor's cold." Her voice was soft, but her hand reached behind her back, gripping something metallic glint, small bottle. My heart thudded. I took a step back. "Mum, what's that?" She blinked. "Your medication. You've been missing doses again." I shook my head. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." She moved forward. I ran. I sprinted up the stairs, slammed my door, and jammed a chair under the handle. Her voice came muffled. "You're sick, Michael. You need help." I was shaking so hard, my teeth clicked. The window was nailed shut, but I noticed the old ventilation duct above my bed. It led to the attic. With trembling hands, I unscrewed the vent cover using a fork, hoisted myself up, and crawled through the narrow space. Dust filled my throat. Below, I could hear her pacing. "You'll hurt yourself," she cried. "Please, come down." Her tone had changed, pleading, broken. For a moment, I almost did, but then I remembered the words, "Prepare sedatives." The attic was dark, except for thin rays filtering through cracks. I crawled toward the far side, where an old desk sat under a beam. Stacks of notebooks, VHS tapes, and a camcorder. I hit play on the nearest tape. The image flickered. Me, maybe 6 years old, crying in bed while Mum stood beside me, clipboard in hand. "Day 47, she said on the recording. "Subject responds positively to affection withdrawal. Continue isolation protocol." She looked straight into the camera. "The Foundation will be pleased." I stopped the tape and nearly threw up. I sat there for what felt like hours, shaking, listening to her calling my name from below, alternating between soft coaxing and sharp commands. At some point, exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off, because I woke to a faint smell burning plastic. Smoke curled up through the floorboards. I crawled back to the vent and peered down. Flames licked the wallpaper near the kitchen. "Mum," I shouted instinctively. No answer. I kicked at the vent, metal scraping my skin, and dropped into the hallway. The air was thick with smoke. I stumbled toward the kitchen, covering my mouth. She was sitting on the floor, back against the cabinet, holding a photo of us from years ago. "We were happy," she murmured, eyes glassy. "They said I could prove love makes people obedient, but you were never supposed to know." I grabbed her arm. "We have to go." She looked up at me and smiled faintly. "You're cured, Michael. You can leave now." The words chilled me more than the fire. She reached toward the oven, where flames were spreading fast. I dragged her up, half carrying her toward the door. The bolt she'd installed was stiff, but I threw my shoulder against it until it gave way. The cold air outside hit my face like a slap. We made it out onto the lawn as the fire swallowed the house. She collapsed, coughing, clutching my sleeve. "They'll come for you now," she whispered. "They always do when the trial ends." I didn't understand, but her eyes were fixed on something behind me. A black van was turning onto our street, headlights cutting through the smoke. Panic surged in my chest. I stumbled to my feet, dragging her. "Who are they?" I shouted. She didn't answer. She just smiled, faintly, as if relieved. "You'll see." Then her hand went limp. By the time I reached the edge of the field, the van's doors had opened. 2 men in gray coats stepped out, carrying medical kits. "Michael Fraser?" one called. I froze. "Stay back," I yelled. One of them raised his hands. "We're with the Inverness Research Institute. Your mother was part of a long-term behavioral study. We need to ensure you're stable." My mind reeled. "Stable?" I shouted. "She locked me in that house for 20 years. They exchanged a glance. The shorter one said quietly, "You were both participants." She volunteered. "You were the subject." The data was invaluable. I ran. I don't know how long, maybe until dawn. Eventually, I reached a small petrol station on the outskirts of town. The clerk gave me odd looks, but when I said my house burned down, he called the police. They took me to a hospital, and for the first time in my life, a real doctor examined me. No illness, no immune disorder, nothing. I was perfectly healthy. When I told them about the experiment, about the men, about the tapes, they looked skeptical. The site where our house stood was cleared within days, declared unsafe. No trace of the van or any research institute was found. For months, I lived in a care home while authorities sorted things out. They said my mother suffered from delusional psychosis with obsessive tendencies. The notes and tapes were dismissed as fabrications of her illness. But I know what I saw. The handwriting on those forms wasn't hers alone. There were typed letterheads, institutional stamps, and reference numbers that someone tried very hard to erase later. Sometimes, I still dream about that house, the sound of her voice calling me Subject 002, the feeling of the bolt locking behind me. I've built a life since then, of sorts. I have a small flat, a job at the library, friends who think I'm quiet but kind. They don't know I keep the old binder hidden behind my wardrobe. It's half burned, but the last page is still legible. It says, Objective achieved. Long-term isolation yields permanent dependency. Recommend follow-up at maturity stage. I used to think it referred to my mother's dependency on me. Now, I'm not so sure. Last week, I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper. It said in typewritten font, Subject 002 observation continues. Do not relocate. At first, I thought it was a cruel prank. But when I looked up, there was a gray van parked across the street. Same model, same color. I closed the curtains and sat on the floor, heart pounding like it did all those years ago. I don't think she lied about everything. Maybe she really was keeping me safe, just not from illness. Maybe she knew they'd never stop watching. I haven't left the flat in 3 days now. There's food in the cupboard, the air here feels cleaner somehow, and I've started writing notes again. Observation schedule, Subject 002. If they're still studying me, I'll give them something worth reading. I've always walked that stretch of Pine Street the same way after a night shift, boots crunching on ice, jacket zipped tight against the February wind. At 32, working as a paramedic in Montpelier, I had learned to live on little sleep, the world muted and blurry in the hours between 12 and 6, when the streets were empty and the snow muffled every sound. After my father died, a quiet grief settled in me that never fully left. I lived alone, kept my apartment almost too tidy, and carried the lingering ache of things I never said. That night, around 2:15 in the daughter's morning, I came down the last block toward my building, and something caught my eye. A shadow moving in a living room where all the lights were off. I stopped, thinking it was a neighbor up late, perhaps adjusting a lamp, but there was no glow behind the blinds, no reflection on the icy street. The possible shadow was there, shifting slightly, as if it knew I was watching, performing some strange, slow dance that mimicked the rhythm of my own steps. My chest tightened, and I felt the first tremor of dread in my bones, the metallic taste that had started months ago lingering again, a subtle reminder of fear I didn't want to admit. At first, I tried to shrug it off. Shadows in dark windows are nothing, I told myself, products of tired eyes and long drives through empty streets. But that night, and the next, the same movement appeared in each house I passed. I could see it perfectly, stretching, across walls, over furniture, imitating me exactly when I paused to tie a boot or adjust my coat. I started taking pictures with my phone, zooming in on the windows, hoping for evidence. But every time I tried to capture it, the images blurred into indistinct shapes, the shadow itself warped into objects. Long smear, impossible to recognize. A coworker who lived nearby shrugged when I mentioned it, saying I'd been out on too many night calls, that the winter and the exhaustion were playing tricks on me. I wanted to argue, to make them see, but I didn't. The loneliness made me doubt myself more than anyone else could, and I found myself stopping mid-block, staring at each window until the cold crept through my coat and into my bones. One night, around 3:30, I stopped outside a corner house where I'd never noticed the shadow before. It was perfectly dark inside, no lamps, no television flicker, nothing. And yet, the shape emerged from the center of the room, tall, indistinct, but with movements that mirrored mine exactly. I raised my hands slowly, and the shadow lifted a matching arm, frozen for a heartbeat, then drifting the same way I drifted backward. I could feel my heart hammering in my throat, my hands trembling so badly I dropped my phone. When I picked it up, the screen was cracked, small shards reflecting a version of the street I didn't recognize. The shadow somehow fractured in multiple angles, layered on top of itself. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but I knew the moment I mentioned it, they would laugh or dismiss it. My neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, had seen me staring for hours once and said nothing when I asked about the shadows, later insisting she hadn't noticed anything at all. The denial made the emptiness grow, the isolation sharper, a quiet gnawing that I could not shake. The third night, I noticed a new detail. The shadow didn't just mimic my movements, it sometimes anticipated them. When I slowed, it paused. When I ducked to adjust my shoelaces, it bent slightly before I even moved. My breath caught, the metallic taste returning, tangy in the back of my mouth, a reminder of how tightly fear could grip. My palms felt cold, sticky, as if the air itself pressed against me. I tried to leave the street, taking a longer route home, but no matter where I turned, the shadow seemed to find me. Once, I passed under a street lamp that flickered weakly, and the shadow split across the windows of two different houses, moving as if two entities were perfectly synchronized. I stopped, rubbing my forehead, feeling a small, purplish mark spreading across my wrist, like the bruise of a tight grip. Though I had done nothing to injure myself. The mark throbbed faintly, another proof that what I was seeing was not imaginary, that the night was leaving traces on me I couldn't erase. I began walking home earlier, trying to avoid Pine Street altogether, but exhaustion and routine forced me back. One evening, I passed the same row of houses and noticed a faint outline in a ground-floor window, the shadow sitting in a chair as if it had waited for me. I slowed, and the movement became fluid, synchronized, eerily intimate in its imitation. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a chill, crawling across my shoulders, and the metallic taste was stronger now, bitter and hot. I spoke aloud. "Who's there?" My voice seemed swallowed by the night. For a moment, the shadow froze, then mimicked the words, though of course it was silent, its lips never moving. I stumbled back, almost tripping on the ice, and felt the bruise on my wrist throb again, as if it were reacting to my panic. I made it home that night, with my heart still hammering, vowing never to return to the street after dark. But the next morning, I could not resist checking, a compulsive need for confirmation. I pressed my face to the window, expecting nothing, but the shadow was there again, perfectly still, waiting. I realized it wasn't just mimicking me, it was anticipating my movements, studying me. I took photos, shook my phone in frustration as the images corrupted themselves. The shadows, stretching, fragmenting, layering into something unrecognizable. I even showed the images to a colleague at the station, someone I trusted, but they laughed and said I needed rest, that the camera didn't capture what I thought I saw. I wanted to scream, to make them understand, but instead I felt the walls of my world closing in, the shadows outside, the bruises on my wrist and forearm, the bitter taste in my mouth, all confirming the truth. I could not escape. Someone or something was following me, marking me, copying me in silence. I stopped walking down Pine Street at night completely. I take different routes now, longer, more circuitous, avoiding the familiar houses where the shadow waits. The bruises faded but never fully disappeared, faint outlines that appear in the right light, reminders of the nights I faced that silent, mimicking presence. The photos remain on my phone, corrupted, layers of darkness and reflection that defy explanation, a fragmented record of my fear. I can still feel it sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, in reflections, on icy windows when I'm alone, the anticipation of motion that mirrors my own. It has changed the way I move, the way I breathe at night, the way I allow myself to step outside after long shifts. If you see a shadow in a window when the lights are off, one that moves like you, pauses when you pause, follows without sound, do not stop to look. Walk past quickly, keep your distance, and do not linger. I know now what it feels like to be watched in perfect silence, and I would not wish it on anyone. I used to leave my classroom every day around 4:30, the hallways still echoing with the laughter and chatter of children who had no idea how fragile the world outside could be. My apartment in Waterville, Maine, was a short walk from the school, past the small neighborhood playground, blanketed in snow, where the swings creaked faintly even in still air. I lived alone with my daughter, Mara, and had gotten used to the silence after she went to sleep, filling the empty apartment with the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car scraping through icy streets. It was January, 2 years ago, and the wind had been relentless for days, piling drifts against fences and the sidewalks. That evening, I opened the front door to find a tiny doll's mitten, red and woolen, facing toward me like a warning, sitting on the doormat. I picked it up with gloved fingers, staring at it, the metallic taste of worry on my tongue, and for a moment I imagined Mara had dropped it, though she had been safely home all day. At first, I rationalized everything. The mitten must have been misplaced, blown from another yard, or left behind by some careless neighbor child. But the feeling in my chest, an insistent tug of dread I couldn't shake, made my stomach knot. The next morning, I noticed the swing set at the park, the one single swing at the far end, moving slightly despite the lack of wind. I rubbed my eyes, sure it was my imagination, but the chains squeaked, softly, like a hollow warning, and the snow beneath it was disturbed, as though someone had been there in the night. I shook my head, walking briskly past it on the way to school, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal. Still, the mitten stayed in my pocket, damp from the snow, its tiny red fibers pressed against my hand like a pulse I couldn't ignore. My own mind felt heavier than the cold that seeped through my coat, weighed down by the constant anxiety I carried about Mara, about the children I taught, about the world that seemed to creep closer, in ways I could not control. The first truly wrong thing happened the next night. I returned from school, leaving Mara with a babysitter while I ran errands and passed the playground. The swing was moving again, gently, back and forth, as though it had learned a rhythm from me. Beneath it sat a small plastic car, its wheels, half buried in snow, positioned carefully toward the swing. I froze, my heart hammering, and a metallic taste rose in my mouth. Someone had placed it there. I knew it. Someone had been watching. I crouched, brushing snow from the toy, my gloves leaving streaks of red and black in the powder. I called the police the next morning, describing the playground, the swing, the toys. They listened politely, but with the detached disbelief that made the inside of my chest ache. "Probably kids playing pranks," the officer said. "Keep your doors locked. Don't worry so much." Their words should have reassured me, but they didn't. I felt more isolated than ever, as if the warning had been ignored by the world, leaving me to guard it alone. Over the following week, the pattern continued. Each night I passed the playground, the swing moving by itself, the chains squeaking like old hinges in a quiet house. Someone left small items, a tiny scarf, a worn stuffed animal, a single mitten paired with the first. I tried to record it once, my phone balanced on the fence, but the footage was corrupted, the swings blurred and elongated, moving unnaturally, shadows stretched beyond reason. Mara noticed a bruise on my wrist one evening, faint but stubborn, the result of gripping the swing's chains too tightly when I had tried to steady it one night. I explained it away as clumsiness, but the ache remained, a proof I could not ignore. My neighbor, Mrs. Harding, saw me pacing one evening, staring at the playground through frosted windows. "You've got too much imagination, dear," she said, shaking her head. "It's just snow, just shadows. Don't let it bother you." Her words hit like another shove into loneliness. I was the only one seeing it, the only one responsible for noticing, and the thought that someone or something knew it was there, unseen, watching, gnawed at me. The hollow squeak of the swing became a motif I could not escape. I would hear it through closed windows, faint and high-pitched, like a breath pressed against metal. One night, I walked closer, past the snowbank, and saw the swing shift slightly as I approached. My stomach flipped. I stopped, breath visible in the frigid air, gloves slick with condensation. Beneath the swing lay a small row of toys, all facing outward, toward me, as if laid deliberately for my attention. I bent down, touched one, and a whisper of static or my imagination seemed to echo, "Do you see?" I stumbled back, the chains squeaking again, and realized I was trembling so badly my boots sank unevenly into the icy snow. The feeling of being watched was no longer abstract. It was intimate, personal. I called a friend, a fellow teacher, telling her what I had seen, the words tumbling out fast, breathless. She listened, quiet for a moment, then laughed softly. "You've had a long day, Clara. Snow makes things look weird. Get some sleep." I hung up, alone again, the clear wind curling around the playground, pressing through the gaps in the fence like fingers, and I knew sleep would not bring comfort anymore. I tried a different approach. I went early, before dusk, to the playground and photographed the swing, the footprints, the toys left beneath it. I showed them to my brother over video call. "See?" I said, pointing to the small items, my voice shaking. "Someone's been leaving them, watching me, maybe Mara. I don't know." He frowned, adjusting the angle of his camera. "Clara, I see snow, I see toys. Maybe you're imagining it, maybe you're stressed. Stop seeing threats where there aren't any." His dismissal hit harder than I expected. I realized then that no one would validate what I was experiencing. The snow, the squeak of the chains, the row of toys, they existed, but the world beyond my front door refused to acknowledge. I was alone in watching, alone in fearing, and the anxiety I carried for Mara, for the children in my care, became unbearable, a weight that I could not set down. By the third week, my encounters escalated in ways I could not rationalize. One night, I left the house to take out trash, the sky dark, wind slicing at my face. I froze at the sight of the swing moving, and beneath it, a doll sat propped upright, its small eyes staring outward. I stepped closer, and it rocked slightly as if acknowledging my presence. I felt bile rise, metallic and bitter. My hands shook, leaving faint red streaks in the snow where I had brushed against the chain. I cursed, turned, and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me, chest heaving, breath short. The next morning, Mara asked why I looked so pale, and I smiled tightly, saying I had slipped on ice. I did not tell her about the doll. Mittens, the stuffed animals lined up beneath the swing like messages only I could read. A few nights later, I dared to walk past the playground, phone flashlight in hand. The swing moved gently, chains squeaking in the still night, and beneath it, toys arranged precisely. A car, a stuffed bear, a tiny mitten. I knelt, my gloves brushing snow off the objects, and the chill of the night seemed to press against my skull. I could feel the presence, close enough to brush against my skin, yet impossible to locate. I left the toys where they were, shivering, and hurried home. The bruise on my wrist aching from the last time I had gripped the chain. I locked every door, double-checked windows, and stood for a long while in the kitchen, listening. The hollow squeak seemed to linger, carried through the wind, echoing in my apartment as if the playground itself had crept indoors. Eventually, I stopped going near the playground after dark. The toys continued to appear, the swing continued to move, but I refused to walk past it alone, refused to witness the evidence. The snow kept falling, relentless and white, erasing footprints, covering small warnings left in the night. I changed my routine, keeping Mara close, walking her to school in daylight and retrieving her before dusk. The bruise on my wrist faded slowly but never completely, a stubborn reminder that I had touched the swing, that I had interacted with whatever presence lingered there. I kept photographs and a notebook where I recorded the nightly disturbances, the arrangement of toys, the squeak of the chain, and each time I looked at them, the images seemed to warp slightly, toys shifting position, snow appearing disturbed where it had been smooth. My friends and family, even those who visited, claimed to see nothing. I was alone in knowing the truth of the playground, and that solitude left me hollow, cautious, hyper-aware of the winter night and the small, secret things left in it. Now, 2 years later, I still avoid the playground after dark. I cannot walk past it without a shiver crawling up my spine, without remembering the squeak, the hollow warning, the careful arrangement of toys, the way the presence had seemed to watch, patient and precise. Mara sleeps safely, and I try to convince myself that the toys, the swing, and the snow are nothing but coincidence, remnants of wind and imagination. But the bruise on my wrist remains faintly, stubborn in its place, a physical anchor to memory. The photographs and notebook remain as well, slightly corrupted, objects shifted from where I thought I had left them, proof of a reality that no one else acknowledges. If you ever walk past a playground in January, late at night, and notice a single swing moving despite the still air, or find a small toy facing your house, do not approach. Do not linger. Step away, lock your doors, and stay inside. Sometimes, presence does not need to be seen to be known, and sometimes, the warning comes in the quiet squeak of a chain, in a small mitten left in the snow, in the invisible eyes that follow and wait. I moved to Rangeley, Maine, 5 years ago. After the divorce finalized, a man emptied of routine and family, scraping together quiet days with fishing and long walks along the frozen lake. The nights were bitter, sub-zero, and the lake stretched wide and still, a gray mirror reflecting the frost and sky, empty and silent. I had a small cabin near the shore, heated just enough to keep the cold from stealing my bones, and I spent evenings in the worn leather chair by the window, mug of black coffee in hand, listening to the creak of the ice under my own feet when I went out. Loneliness had settled into my chest like snow in a gutter, compact and unyielding, and I had started naming it, whispering it to the wind, as though giving it form made it manageable. That night, just past 10, I noticed something across the lake, a faint yellow glow in the windows of a cabin that, as far as I knew, was supposed to be empty. At first, I thought it might be a reflection of my own lights, or a trick of the ice and fog, but then I saw them figures moving behind the panes, shadows shifting in ways that suggested motion and intent. The first time I mentioned it to anyone, I almost laughed. At myself. I called my brother, who lived in Portland, and described the lights, the figures, the way they seemed to pause and turn as if observing me through the distance. "Must be other fishermen, or someone staying at a rental," he said. I wanted to believe him, but the feeling that gnawed at me was different, more intimate. The shadows seemed familiar, almost familial, the way they moved in pairs or lingered by a window as if waiting for someone who never came. I kept watch for nights, coffee growing cold beside me, the metallic taste of anxiety bitter on my tongue, tracing the ice. Cracks with my gaze. Sometimes the reflections in the ice didn't match the figures inside, stretching and warping, lingering in places where no one could stand. I rationalized it at first as tricks of light or fatigue, but the nagging fear in my chest would not settle, and sleep felt thin and brittle, easily torn by the thought of eyes watching from the far shore. One night, I ventured across the ice, bundled in layers, boots crunching on the frozen surface. The fog hung low, a gray curtain through which the cabin flickered like a candle. I got within 100 feet of the shore, the glow brighter now, and saw a small chair tipped over near the front door, snow falling gently on it as though no one had touched it for years. A handprint pressed faintly into the icy crust, too small for mine, too exact for a deer or fox. I took a photograph, shaking, phone trembling, hoping for proof. The image was corrupted, a smear of light and shadow, the chair half dissolved into nothingness, the handprint impossible to locate the next day. When I showed it to my brother, he frowned, adjusted his computer screen, then shook his head. "Looks like glare from the ice, bro. Uriah. Staring too long. Get some sleep." His dismissal hit harder than the cold, and I realized that my isolation was not just physical, it was existential. I was alone in seeing the unexplainable, alone in fearing it, and every night I went to sleep with the reflection of figures lingering in my mind, twisting in the ice, haunting the spaces of memory I thought were mine alone. The encounters became more intimate and urgent. One night, I woke to a cracking sound, low and resonant, traveling across the frozen lake. I wrapped my bathrobe tightly around me and leaned against the window, watching the glow. A figure stepped outside, and as it did, the ice near the cabin reflected not one, but two forms. The figure and a shadow crouched beside it, as though a child had been left behind. I pressed my palm to the cold glass, heart thudding, breath fogging the pain, and the figure froze, raising an arm slightly as if to wave. I flinched and fell back, boots scuffing the floor, hands trembling. The bruise on my wrist appeared that night, faint but stubborn, a mark from gripping the windowsill too tightly, a reminder that what I had seen was not a dream. I called the local ranger the next day, describing the cabin and the figures. He listened, nodded politely, and then said, "Cabin's been empty for years, buddy. You're alone out there. Don't worry about shadows." His words, meant to reassure, only deepened the ache of loneliness, the sensation that the lake itself carried secrets I could not touch, that the figures I watched were tethered to a world I could never fully enter. A week later, I returned with a notebook, recording dates, times, and the positions of lights and figures. I drew maps of ice cracks, markings, and reflected shapes, trying to make sense of the subtle changes in reflection and shadow. One night, while sketching near the window, I noticed a figure inside the cabin move closer to the door. The reflection in the ice distorted as it approached, the shadow stretching impossibly, crossing cracks that didn't exist in the surface. I leaned forward, breath shallow, and heard a faint creak that could have been ice or a floorboard. I was frozen in the moment, caught between disbelief and undeniable fear. I scribbled furiously in the notebook, fingers numb, coffee forgotten on the counter, and when I looked up, the figure had retreated, but the ice still bore reflections that had no source in the cabin, confirming to me that something was wrong, something beyond ordinary perception. The mark on my wrist itched faintly, the skin dry and flaking, as if echoing the memory of that night, proof I could not erase. Later, I tried to approach closer, walking along the shoreline, lantern in hand. The fog thickened, the cold biting through gloves and layers. The cabin was still aglow, and as I stepped carefully over ice fissures, I saw a pair of figures at the window, one taller, one smaller, and the reflection fractured across a split in the ice, breaking them into fragments that shifted independently of reality. My heart raced, each exhale a cloud in the air. I thought I heard whispers, the faintest echo of voices calling my name, though no one else could be there. I stumbled back to my own cabin, knees scraping the frozen ground, hands raw, and locked the door, listening to the wind whip across the lake, carrying the glow like fire across the ice. I could not explain it, could not justify it, and each night the compulsion to watch grew stronger, a ritual of fear I could not resist. The bruise remained, faint but persistent, a reminder that what I experienced had left physical traces, undeniable in a world that refused to see them. By the third week, the reflections had become almost sentient in their movement. The smaller figure, which I had convinced myself might be a child, lingered at the window, moving slightly when I shifted my gaze. Sometimes, it appeared to glance down at the ice cracks, where its reflection fragmented and danced like a spirit. I tried photographing it, recording video, but every attempt produced images warped beyond recognition, reflections, twisted in ways that could not exist. I showed the files to a neighbor, an older man who had lived by the lake for decades. He shrugged and said, "Ice does funny things in the fog, you're seeing tricks, don't lose sleep over it." I nodded politely, though my hands shook. No one could confirm what I saw. No one could acknowledge the quiet intrusion into my lonely nights. I felt watched and alone in equal measure, a silent audience to something unbound by the laws I knew, tethered only to the reflection in ice and glass, to the glow across the lake. The final encounter that cemented the change in me happened on a night so cold the fog seemed to cling to my skin, icy and heavy. I went to the window, notebook and camera at hand, and watched the cabin. The taller figure seemed to beckon the smaller one toward the door. The reflection fractured across ice cracks, and the smaller figure turned and looked directly at me, or at least at my reflection in the ice. I felt a shiver that reached my bones, cold and intimate, as though it recognized my own isolation, my yearning for family, the empty days I had counted in solitude. I backed away, knocking the notebook to the floor. When I reached for it, I saw a smudge of frost on my hand that did not melt, a residual mark that seemed almost alive, proof of contact. I shut off the lights, locked the cabin door, and spent hours awake, listening to the wind over the ice, waiting, fearing, haunted by the memory of their gaze, a gaze that no one else could confirm or understand. Now, 5 years later, I still glance at the lake every winter night. The cabin remains empty to the world, my photographs and notebooks corrupted or warped beyond explanation, and the bruise, faint but persistent, lingers on my 2/7 wrist. I cannot explain what I saw, cannot prove it, but I know that the figures, the reflections, and the glow exist in a realm that brushes against mine in the coldest nights. I avoid walking on the ice after dark, avoid crossing toward that distant shore, but I cannot stop the habit of watching, the quiet compulsion to check if the small figures linger, waiting as I do, tethered to the cracks in the ice, waiting for someone to notice. If you ever find yourself staring across a frozen lake on a sub-zero winter night and see lights flickering in a supposedly abandoned cabin, do not assume it is empty. Do not cross the ice. Observe from a distance, note the reflections, but resist the pull to approach. Sometimes, the loneliness that clings to you is not yours alone, and sometimes the eyes that look back from the glow are waiting, patient, and intimate, for someone like you to understand their presence.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. If you stuck around until the end, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. As always, I'm looking for more story ideas, so drop a comment below with any themes or experiences you'd like to hear next. Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep your eyes open.